6. Ancient Atomic Warfare. We learn from history that we do not learn anything from history. Mark Twain. War is an instrument entirely inefficient toward redressing wrong, and multiplies instead of indemnifying losses. Thomas Jefferson. Incredible evidence for an ancient atomic war. The following item appeared in the New York Herald Tribune on February 16, 1947, and was repeated by Ivan T. Sanderson in the January 1970 issue of his magazine, Pursuit. When the first atomic bomb exploded in New Mexico, the desert sand turned to fused green glass. This fact, according to the magazine Free World, has given certain archaeologists a turn. They have been digging in the ancient Euphrates Valley and have uncovered a layer of agrarian culture 8,000 years old, and a layer of herdsman culture much older, and a still older caveman culture. Recently they reached another layer of fused green glass. Think it over, brother. It is well known that atomic detonations on or above a sandy desert will melt the silicon in the sand and turn the surface of the earth into a sheet of glass. But if sheets of ancient desert glass can be found in various parts of the world, does it mean that ancient atomic wars were fought in the past? Or at the very least that atomic testing occurred in the dim ages of history? This is a startling theory, but one that is not lacking in evidence, as such ancient sheets of desert glass are a geological fact. Lightning strikes can sometimes fuse sand, meteorologists contend, but this is always in a distinctive root-like pattern. These strange geological oddities are called fulgurites and manifest as branched tubular forms, rather than as flat sheets of fused sand. Therefore, lightning is largely ruled out as the cause of such finds by geologists, who prefer to hold on to the theory of a meteor or comet strike as the cause. The problem with this theory is that there is usually no crater associated with these anomalous sheets of glass. Brad Steiger and Ron Calais report in their book Mysteries of Time and Space that Albion W. Hart, one of the first engineers to graduate from Massachusetts Institute of Technology, was assigned an engineering project in the interior of Africa. While he and his men were traveling to an almost inaccessible region, they had first to cross a great expanse of desert. At the time he was puzzled and quite unable to explain a large expanse of greenish glass which covered the sands as far as he could see, writes Margaret Casson in an article on Hart's life in the magazine Rocks and Minerals. She then goes on to mention that, later on during his life, he passed by the White Sands area after the first atomic explosion there, and he recognized the same type of silica fusion which he had seen 50 years earlier in the African desert. The mystery of tektites. Large desert areas strewn with mysterious globules of glass, known as tektites, are occasionally discussed in geological literature. These blobs of hardened glass is a liquid in fact, are thought to come from meteorite impacts in most cases, but the evidence shows that in many cases there is no impact crater. Another explanation is that tektites have a terrestrial explanation, one that includes atomic war or high-tech weapons capable of melting sand. The tektite debate was summed up in an article in Scientific American by John O'Keefe entitled The Tektite Problem. Said O'Keefe, "If tektites are terrestrial, it means that some process exists by which soil or common rocks can be converted in an instant into homogeneous, water-free, bubble-free glass, and be propelled thousands of miles above the atmosphere. If tektites come from the moon, it seems to follow that there is at least one powerful volcano somewhere on the moon that has erupted at least as recently as 750,000 years ago. Neither possibility is easy to accept. Yet one of them must be accepted, and I believe it is feasible to pick the more reasonable one by rejecting the more unlikely. The key to solving the tektite problem is an insistence on a physically reasonable hypothesis and a resolute refusal to be impressed by mere numerical coincidences, such as the similarity of terrestrial sediments to tektite material. I believe that the lunar volcanism hypothesis is the only one physically possible, and that we have to accept it. If it leads to unexpected but not impossible conclusions, that is precisely its utility. To cite just one example of the utility, the lunar origin of tektites strongly supports the idea that the moon was formed by fission of the earth. Tektites are indeed much more like terrestrial rocks than one would expect of a chance assemblage. If tektites come from a lunar magma, then deep inside the moon there must be material that is very much like the mantle of the earth, more like the mantle than it is like the shallower parts of the moon, from which the lunar surface basalts have originated. If the moon was formed by fission of the earth, the object that became the moon would have been heated intensely, and from the outside, and would have lost most of its original mass, and in particular the more volatile elements. The lavas constituting most of the moon's present surface were erupted early in the moon's history, when its heat was concentrated in the shallow depleted zone quite near the surface. During the recent periods represented by tektite falls, the sources of lunar volcanism have necessarily been much deeper, so that any volcanoes responsible for tektites have drawn on the lunar material that suffered least during the period of ablation, and is therefore most like unaltered terrestrial mantle material. Ironically, that would explain why tektites are in some ways more like terrestrial rocks than they are like the rocks of the lunar surface. Mysterious glass in the Egyptian desert. One of the strangest mysteries of ancient Egypt is that of the great glass sheets that were only discovered in 1932. In December of that year, P. Clayton, a surveyor for the Egyptian Geological Survey, was driving among the dunes of the Great Sand Sea near the Sod Plateau in the virtually uninhabited area just north of the southwestern corner of Egypt, when he heard his tires crunch on something that wasn't sand. It turned out to be large pieces of marvelously clear yellow-green glass. In fact, this wasn't just any ordinary glass, but ultra-pure glass that was an astonishing 98% silica. Clayton wasn't the first person to come across this field of glass, as various prehistoric hunters and nomads had obviously also found the now famous Libyan desert glass, or LDG. The glass had been used in the past to make knives and other sharp-edged tools as well as other objects. A carved scarab of LDG was even found in Tutankhamun's tomb, indicating that the glass was sometimes used for jewelry. An article in the British science magazine New Scientist by Giles Wright entitled The Riddle of the Sands says that LDG is the purest natural silica glass ever found. Over 1,000 tons of it are strewn across hundreds of kilometers of bleak desert. Some of the chunks weigh 26 kilograms, but most LDG exists in smaller, angular pieces, looking like shards left when a giant green bottle was smashed by colossal forces. According to the article, pure as it is, LDG does contain tiny bubbles, white wisps, and inky black swirls. The whitish inclusions consist of refractory minerals, such as cristobalite. The ink-like swirls, though, are rich in iridium, which is diagnostic of an extraterrestrial impact, such as a meteorite or comet, according to conventional wisdom. The general theory is that the glass was created by the searing, sand-melting impact of a cosmic projectile. However, there are serious problems with this theory, says Wright, and many mysteries concerning this stretch of desert containing the pure glass. The main problem? Where did this immense amount of widely dispersed glass shards come from? There is no evidence of an impact crater of any kind. The surface of the Great Sand Sea shows no sign of a giant crater, and neither do microwave probes made deep into the sand by satellite radar. Furthermore, LDG seems to be too pure to be derived from a messy cosmic collision. Wright mentions that known impact craters, such as the one at Wabar in Saudi Arabia, are littered with bits of iron and other meteorite debris. This is not the case with the Libyan desert glass sites. What is more, LDG is concentrated in two areas rather than one. One area is oval-shaped. The other is a circular ring 6 kilometers wide and 21 kilometers in diameter. The ring's wide center is devoid of LDG. One theory is that there was a soft projectile impact, which would mean that a meteorite, perhaps 30 meters in diameter, detonated about 10 kilometers or so above the Great Sand Sea. The searing blast of hot air might have melted the sand beneath. Such a craterless impact is thought to have occurred in the 1908 Tunguska event in Siberia, at least as far as mainstream science is concerned. That event, like the pure desert glass, remains a mystery. Another theory has a meteorite glancing off the desert surface, leaving a glassy crust and a shallow crater that was soon filled in. But there are two known areas of LDG. Were there two cosmic projectiles in tandem? It is possible that the vitrified desert is the result of the atomic wars of the ancient past. It is also possible that it was affected by a Tesla-type beam weapon, which melted the desert, perhaps in a test. An article by Kenneth Oakley appeared on the subject of the mysterious desert glass in the British journal Nature, entitled Dating the Libyan Desert Silica Glass. Said Oakley, "Pieces of natural silica glass up to 16 pounds in weight occur scattered sparsely in an oval area measuring 130 kilometers north to south and 53 kilometers from east to west in the sand sea of the Libyan desert. This remarkable material, which is almost pure, 97% silica, relatively light, clear and yellowish-green in color, has the qualities of a gemstone. It was discovered by the Egyptian survey expedition under Mr. P. A. Clayton in 1932, and was thoroughly investigated by Dr. L. J. Spencer, who joined a special expedition of the survey for this purpose in 1934. The pieces are found in sand-free corridors between north-south dune ridges, about 100 meters high and 2 to 5 kilometers apart. These corridors, or streets, have a rubbly surface, rather like that of a speedway track, formed by angular gravel and red loamy weathering debris overlying Nubian sandstone. The pieces of glass lie on this surface or partly embedded in it. Only a few small fragments were found below the surface, and none deeper than about 1 meter. All the pieces on the surface have been pitted or smoothed by sandblast. The distribution of the glass is patchy. While undoubtedly natural, the origin of the Libyan silica glass is uncertain. In its constitution, it resembles the tektites of supposed cosmic origin, but these are much smaller. Tektites are usually black, although one variety found in Bohemia and Moravia and known as Moldavite is clear deep green. The Libyan silica glass has also been compared with the glass formed by the fusion of sand in the heat generated by the fall of a great meteorite. For example, at Wabar in Arabia and at Henbury in Central Australia. Reporting the findings of his expedition, Dr. Spencer said that he had not been able to trace the Libyan glass to any source. No fragments of meteorites or indications of meteorite craters could be found in the area of its distribution. He said, "It seemed easier to assume that it had simply fallen from the sky." It would be of considerable interest if the time of origin or arrival of the silica glass in the sand sea could be determined geologically or archaeologically. Its restriction to the surface or top layer of a superficial deposit suggests that it is not of great antiquity from the geological point of view. On the other hand, it has clearly been there since prehistoric times. Some of the flakes were submitted to Egyptologists in Cairo, who regarded them as late Neolithic or pre-dynastic. In spite of a careful search by Dr. Spencer and the late Mr. A. Lucas, no objects of silica glass could be found in the collections from Tutankhamun's tomb or from any of the other dynastic tombs. No potsherds were encountered in the silica glass area, but in the neighborhood of the flakings some crude spear points of glass were found, also some quartzite implements, quernstones, and ostrich shell fragments. Oakley is apparently incorrect when he says that LDG was not found in Tutankhamun's tomb, as, according to O'Keefe, a piece was. At any rate, it appears that areas of the Libyan desert are yet to be explained. Are the vitrified areas of the North Africa desert evidence of an ancient war? A war that may have turned North Africa and Arabia into the desert that it is today. The Vitrified Forts of Scotland. One of the great mysteries of classical archaeology is the existence of many vitrified forts in Scotland. Are they also evidence of some ancient atomic war? Maybe, but maybe not. There are said to be at least 60 such forts throughout Scotland. Among the most well-known are Tapanoth, Donedeer, Craigfadrig, near Inverness, Abernathy, near Perth, Dunlachai, in Ross, Cromarty, Arca Unskil, Eilean Nagor, and Bute Donegal on the Sound of Bute on Arran Island. Another well-known vitrified fort is Cowadale Hill Fort in Argyll, West Scotland. One of the best examples of a vitrified fort is Tapanoth, which is near the village of Rhynie in northeastern Scotland. This massive fort from prehistory is on the summit of a mountain of the same name, which commands an impressive view of the Aberdeenshire countryside. At first glance it seems that the walls are made of a rubble of stones, but on closer look it is apparent that they are made not of dry stones, but of melted rocks. What were once individual stones are now black and cindery masses, fused together by heat that must have been so intense that molten rivers of rock once ran down the walls. Reports on vitrified forts were made as far back as 1880, when Edward Hamilton wrote an article entitled "Vitrified Forts on the West Coast of Scotland" in the Archaeological Journal. In his article, Hamilton describes several sites in detail, including Arca Unskil. At the point where Loch Naniua begins to narrow, where the opposite shore is about 1.5 to 2 miles distant, is a small promontory connected with the mainland by a narrow strip of sand and grass, which evidently at one time was submerged by the rising tide. On the flat summit of this promontory are the ruins of a vitrified fort, the proper name for which is Arca Unskil. The rocks on which this fort are placed are metamorphic gneiss, covered with grass and ferns, and rise on 3 sides almost perpendicular for about 110 feet from the sea level. The smooth surface on the top is divided by a slight depression into 2 portions. On the largest, with precipitous sides to the sea, the chief portion of the fort is situated, and occupies the whole of the flat surface. It is of somewhat oval form. The circumference is about 200 feet, and the vitrified walls can be traced its entire length. We dug under the vitrified mass, and there found what was extremely interesting, as throwing some light on the manner in which the fire was applied for the purpose of vitrification. The internal part of the upper or vitrified wall, for about 1 foot or 1.5 feet, was untouched by the fire, except that some of the flat stones were slightly agglutinated together, and that the stones, all feldspathic, were placed in layers upon one another. It was evident, therefore, that a rude foundation of boulder stones was first formed upon the original rock, and then a thick layer of loose, mostly flat stones of feldspathic sand, and of a different kind from those found in the immediate neighborhood, were placed on this foundation, and then vitrified by heat applied externally. This foundation of loose stones is found also in the vitrified fort of Dunmac Snuchan, on Loch Etive. Hamilton describes another vitrified fort that is much larger, situated on the island at the entrance of Loch Eilert. This island, locally termed Eilean Nagor, is the most eastern and is bounded on all sides by precipitous gneiss rocks. It is the abode and nesting place of numerous seabirds. The flat surface on the top is 120 feet from the sea level, and the remains of the vitrified forts are situated on this, oblong in form with a continuous rampart of vitrified wall 5 feet thick, attached at the southwest end to a large upright rock of gneiss. The space enclosed by this wall is 420 feet in circumference and 70 feet in width. The rampart is continuous and about 5 feet in thickness. At the eastern end is a great mass of wall in situ, vitrified on both sides. In the center of the enclosed space is a deep depression, in which are masses of the vitrified walls strewn about, evidently detached from their original site. Hamilton naturally asks a few obvious questions about the forts. Were these structures built as a means of defense? Was the vitrification the result of design or accident? How was the vitrification produced? In the vitrification process, huge blocks of stones are fused with smaller rubble and form a hard and glassy mass. Explanations for vitrification are few and far between, and none of them are universally accepted. One early theory was that these forts are located on ancient volcanoes, or the remains of them, and that the people used molten stone ejected from eruptions to build their settlements. This idea was replaced with the theory that the builders of the walls had designed the forts in such a way that the vitrification was purposeful, in order to strengthen the walls. This theory postulated that fires had been lit and flammable material added to produce walls strong enough to resist the dampness of the local climate or the invading armies of the enemy. It is an interesting theory, but one that presents several problems. For starters, there is really no indication that such vitrification actually strengthens the walls of the fortress. Rather, it seems to weaken them. In many cases, the walls of the forts seem to have collapsed because of the fires. Also, since the walls of many Scottish forts are only partially vitrified, this would hardly have proved an effective building method. Julius Caesar described a type of wood and stone fortress known as a murus gallicus in his account of the Gallic Wars. This was interesting to those seeking solutions to the vitrified fort mystery, because these forts were made of a stone wall filled with rubble, with wooden logs inside for stability. It seemed logical to suggest that perhaps the burning of such a wood-filled wall might create the phenomenon of vitrification. Some researchers are sure that the builders of the forts caused the vitrification. Arthur C. Clarke quotes one team of chemists from the Natural History Museum in London who were studying the many forts. Considering the high temperatures which have to be produced, and the fact that possibly 60 or so vitrified forts are to be seen in a limited geographical area of Scotland, we do not believe that this type of structure is the result of accidental fires. Careful planning and construction were needed. However, one Scottish archaeologist, Helen Nisbet, believes that a vitrification was not done on purpose by the builders of the forts. In a thorough analysis of rock types used, she reveals that most of the forts were built of stone easily available at the chosen site, and not chosen for their property of vitrification. The vitrification process itself, even if purposely set, is quite a mystery. A team of chemists on Arthur C. Clarke's Mysterious World subjected rock samples from 11 forts to rigorous chemical analysis, and stated that the temperatures needed to produce the vitrification were so intense, up to 1100 degrees Celsius, that a simple burning of walls with wood interlaced with stone could not have achieved such temperatures. Nevertheless, experiments carried out in the 1930s by the famous archaeologist V. Gordon Childe and his colleague Wallace Thornycroft showed that forts could be set on fire and generate enough heat to vitrify the stone. In 1934, these two created a test wall that was 12 feet long, 6 feet wide, and 6 feet high, which was built for them at Plen Colliery in Stirlingshire. They used old fireclay bricks for the faces, pit props as timber, and filled the cavity between the walls with small cubes of basalt rubble. Finally, they covered the top with turf. Then they piled about 4 tons of scrap timber and brushwood against the walls and set fire to them. Because of a snowstorm in progress, a strong wind fanned the blazing mixture of wood and stone so that the inner core did attain some vitrification of the rock. In June of 1937, Childe and Thornycroft duplicated their test vitrification at the ancient fort of Rahoy in Argyllshire, using rocks found at the site. Their experiments did not resolve any of the questions surrounding vitrified forts, however, because they had only proven that it was theoretically possible to pile enough wood and brush on top of a mixture of wood and stone to vitrify the mass of stone. One criticism of Child is that he seems to have used a larger proportion of wood to stone than many historians believe made up the ancient wood and stone fortresses. An important part of Child's theory was that it was invaders, not the builders, who were assaulting the forts and then setting fire to the walls with piles of brush and wood. However, it is hard to understand why people would have repeatedly built defenses that invaders could destroy with fire, when great ramparts of solid stone would have survived unscathed. Critics of the assault theory point out that in order to generate enough heat by a natural fire, the walls would have to have been specially constructed to create the heat necessary. It seems unreasonable to suggest the builders would specifically create forts to be burned, or that such a great effort would be made by invaders to create the kind of fire it would take to vitrify the walls, at least with traditional techniques. One problem with all the many theories is their assumption of a primitive state of culture associated with ancient Scotland. It is astonishing to think how large and well-coordinated the population or army must have been that built and inhabited these ancient structures. Janet and Colin Board, in their book Mysterious Britain, speak of Maiden Castle to give an idea of the vast extent of this marvel of prehistoric engineering. It covers an area of 120 acres with an average width of 1,500 feet and length of 3,000 feet. The inner circumference is about 1.5 miles round, and it has been estimated, as mentioned earlier, that it would require 250,000 men to defend it. It is hard, therefore, to believe that this construction was intended to be a defensive position. A great puzzle to archaeologists has always been the multiple and labyrinthine east and west entrances at each end of the enclosure. Originally, they may have been built as a way for processional entry by people of the Neolithic era. Later, when warriors of the Iron Age were using the site as a fortress, they probably found them useful as a means of confusing the attacking force trying to gain entry. The fact that so many of these hill forts have two entrances, one north of east and the other south of west, also suggests some form of sun ceremonial. With 250,000 men defending a fort, we are talking about a huge army in a very organized society. This is not a bunch of fur-wearing Picts with spears defending a fort from marauding bands of hunter-gatherers. The questions remain, though, as to what huge army might have occupied these cliffside forts by the sea or lake entrances, and what massive maritime power were these people unsuccessfully defending themselves against. The forts on the western coast of Scotland are reminiscent of the mysterious cliff-top forts in the Aran Islands on the west coast of Ireland. Here we truly have shades of the Atlantis story, with a powerful naval fleet attacking and conquering its neighbors in a terrible war. It has been theorized that the terrible battles of the Atlantis story took place in Wales, Scotland, Ireland, and England. However, in the case of the Scottish vitrified forts, it looks as if these were the losers of a war, not the victors. And defeat can be seen across the land. The war dykes in Sussex, the vitrified forts of Scotland, the utter collapse and disappearance of the civilization that built these things. What long ago Armageddon destroyed ancient Scotland? In ancient times there was a substance known through writings as Greek fire. This was some sort of ancient napalm bomb that was hurled by catapult and could not be put out. Some forms of Greek fire were even said to burn under water and were therefore used in naval battles. The actual composition of Greek fire is unknown, but it must have contained chemicals such as phosphorus, pitch, sulfur, or other flammable chemicals. Could a form of Greek fire have been responsible for the vitrification? While ancient astronaut theorists may believe that extraterrestrials with their atomic weapons vitrified these walls, it seems more likely that they are the result of a man-made apocalypse of a chemical nature. With siege machines, battleships, and Greek fire, did a vast flotilla storm the huge forts and eventually burn them down in a hellish blaze? The evidence of the vitrified forts is clear. Some hugely successful and organized civilization was living in Scotland, England, and Wales in prehistoric times, circa 1000 BC or more, that was building gigantic structures, including forts. This apparently was a maritime civilization that prepared itself for naval warfare as well as other forms of attack. More vitrified ruins. Other vitrified ruins can be found in France, Turkey, and other areas of the Middle East. Vitrified forts in France are discussed in the American Journal of Science, which carried an article entitled, "On the Substances Obtained from Some Forts Vitrifiés in France," by M. Dobray. The author mentions several forts in Brittany and northern France whose granite blocks have been vitrified. He cites the partially fused granitic rocks from the forts of Châteauvieux and of Puy-de-Gaudy, Creuse, also from the neighborhood of Saint-Brieuc, Côte du Nord. Dobray, understandably, could not readily find an explanation for the vitrification. Similarly, the ruins of Hattusa in central Turkey, an ancient Hittite city, are partially vitrified. The Hittites are said to be the inventors of the chariot, and horses were of great importance to them. It is on the ancient Hittite stelae that we first see the chariot being used. However, it seems unlikely that horsemanship and wheeled chariots were first invented by the Hittites. It is highly likely, for instance, that chariots were in use in ancient China at the same time. The Hittites used the unusual double-headed eagle motif, a symbol Germany still uses today. The Hittites are also related to the amazing world of ancient India. Proto-Indic writing is found at Hattusa, and scholars now admit that the civilization of India, as the ancient Indian texts like the Ramayana have said, goes back many millennia. In his 1965 book, The Bible as History, the German historian Werner Keller cites some of the mysteries concerning the Hittites. According to Keller, the Hittites are first mentioned in the Bible in connection with the biblical patriarch Abraham who, in Genesis 23, acquires from the Hittites a burial place in Hebron for his wife Sarah. Conservative classical scholar Keller is confused by this, because the time period of Abraham was circa 2000 to 1800 BC, while the Hittites are traditionally said to have appeared in the 16th century BC. Even more confusing to Keller is the biblical statement that the Hittites are the founders of Jerusalem. This is a fascinating statement, as it would mean that the Hittites also occupied Baalbek, which lies between their realm and Jerusalem. As we have heard, the Temple Mount at Jerusalem is built on a foundation of huge ashlars like Baalbek. The Hittites definitely used the gigantic megalithic construction known as Cyclopean, huge, odd-shaped polygonal blocks perfectly fitted together. The massive walls and gates of Hattusa are eerily similar in construction to those in the high Andes and other megalithic sites around the world. The difference at Hattusa is that parts of the city are vitrified, and the walls of rock are partly melted. If the Hittites were the builders of Jerusalem, it would mean that the ancient Hittite Empire existed for several thousand years, with frontiers with Egypt. Indeed, the Hittite hieroglyphic script is undeniably similar to Egyptian hieroglyphs, probably more so than any other language. Just as Egypt goes back many thousands of years BC and is ultimately connected to Atlantis, so does the ancient Hittite Empire. Like the Egyptians, the Hittites carved massive granite sphinxes built on a cyclopean scale and worshipped the sun. The Hittites also used the common motif of a winged disk for their sun god, just as the Egyptians did. The Hittites were well known in the ancient world because they were the main manufacturer of iron and bronze goods. The Hittites were metallurgists and seafarers. Their winged discs may in fact have been representations of the flying machines called vimanas. Some of the ancient ziggurats of Iran and Iraq also contain vitrified material, sometimes thought by archaeologists to be caused by the Greek fire. For instance, the vitrified remains of the ziggurat at Birs Nimrod, Borsippa, south of Hilla, were once confused with the Tower of Babel. The ruins are crowned by a mass of vitrified brickwork, actual clay bricks fused together by intense heat. This may be due to the horrific ancient wars described in the Ramayana and Mahabharata, although early archaeologists attributed the effect to lightning. Destruction cometh, and they shall seek peace, and there shall be none. Ezekiel, chapter 7, verse 25. Greek fire, plasma guns, and atomic warfare. If one were to believe the great Indian epic of the Mahabharata, fantastic battles were fought in the past with airships, particle beams, chemical warfare, and, presumably, atomic weapons. Just as battles in this century have been fought with incredibly devastating weapons, it may well be that battles in the latter days of Atlantis were fought with highly sophisticated and high-tech weapons. The mysterious Greek fire was a chemical fireball. Incendiary mixtures go back at least to the 5th century B.C., when Aeneas the tactician wrote a book called On the Defense of Fortified Positions. Said he, "And fire itself, which is to be powerful and quite inextinguishable, is to be prepared as follows: pitch, sulphur, tow, granulated frankincense, and pine sawdust in sacks you should ignite, if you wish to set any of the enemy's works on fire." L. Sprague de Camp mentions in his book, The Ancient Engineers, that at some point it was found that petroleum, which seeps out of the ground in Iraq and elsewhere, made an ideal base for incendiary mixtures, because it could be squirted from syringes of the sort then used in fighting fires. Other substances were added to it, such as sulphur, olive oil, rosin, bitumen, salt, and quicklime. Some of these additives may have helped. Sulphur at least made a fine stench, but others did not, although it was thought that they did. Salt, for instance, may have been added because the sodium in it gave the flame a bright orange color. The ancients, supposing that a brighter flame was necessarily a hotter flame, mistakenly believed that salt made the fire burn more fiercely. Such mixtures were put in thin wooden casks and thrown from catapults at hostile ships and at wooden siege engines and defense works. According to de Camp, in 673 A.D. the architect Kallinikos fled ahead of Arab invaders from Heliopolis, Baalbek, to Constantinople. There he revealed to the Emperor Constantine IV an improved formula for a liquid incendiary. This could not only be squirted at the foe, but could also be used with great effect at sea, because it caught fire when it touched the water and floated flaming on the waves. De Camp says that Byzantine galleys were armed with a flame-throwing apparatus in the bow, consisting of a tank of this mixture, a pump, and a nozzle. With the help of this compound, the Byzantines broke the Arab sieges of A.D. 674 to 676 and A.D. 715 to 718, and also beat off the Russian attacks of A.D. 941 and 1043. The incendiary liquid wrought immense havoc. Of 800 Arab ships that attacked Constantinople in 716 A.D., only a handful returned home. The formula for the wet version of Greek fire has never been discovered. Says de Camp, by careful security precautions, the Byzantine emperors succeeded in keeping the secret of this substance, called wet fire or wildfire, so dark that it never did become generally known. When asked about it, they blandly replied that an angel had revealed the formula to the first Constantine. We can therefore only guess the nature of the mixture. According to one disputed theory, wet fire was petroleum with an admixture of calcium phosphide, which can be made from lime, bones, and urine. Perhaps Kallinikos stumbled across this substance in the course of alchemical experiments. Vitrification of brick, rock, and sand may have been caused by any number of high-tech means. New Zealand author Robin Collins suggests in his book Ancient Astronauts, A Time Reversal, that there are 5 methods by which the ancients, or ancient astronauts, might have waged war on various societies on planet Earth. He outlines how these methods are again on the rise in modern society. The 5 methods are plasma guns, fusion torches, holes punched in the ozone layer, manipulation of weather processes, and the release of immense energy such as an atomic blast. As Collins's book was published in Britain in 1976, the mention of holes in the ozone and weather warfare seems strangely prophetic. Explaining the plasma gun, Collins says, "The plasma gun has already been developed experimentally for peaceful purposes. Ukrainian scientists from the Geotechnical Mechanics Institute have experimentally drilled tunnels in iron ore mines by using a plasmatron, i.e. a plasma gas jet, which delivers a temperature of 6,000 degrees Celsius. A plasma, in this case, is an electrified gas. Electrified gases are also featured in the ancient book from India on Vimanas called the Vimanika Shastra, which cryptically talks of using for fuel the liquid metal mercury, which could be a plasma if it were electrified. Collins goes on to describe a fusion torch. There is still another possible method of warfare used by spacemen, or ancient advanced civilizations on Earth. Perhaps the solar mirrors of antiquity really were fusion torches. The fusion torch is basically a further development of the plasma jet. In 1970, a theory to develop a fusion torch was presented at the New York Aerospace Science Meeting by Drs. Bernard J. Eastland and William C. Koff. The basic idea is to generate a fantastic heat of at least 50 million degrees Celsius, which could be contained and controlled. That is, the energy released could be used for many peaceful applications with zero radioactive waste products to avoid contaminating the environment, or zero production of radioactive elements, which would be highly dangerous, such as plutonium, which is the most deadly substance known to man. Thermonuclear fusion occurs naturally in stellar processes and unnaturally in man-made H-bomb explosions. The fusion of a deuterium nuclei, a heavy hydrogen isotope which can be easily extracted from seawater, with another deuterium nuclei, or with tritium, another isotope of hydrogen, or with helium, could be used. The actual fusion torch would be an ionized plasma jet which would vaporize anything and everything that the jet was directed at, if it was to be used for harmful purposes, while for peaceful applications, one use of the torch could be to reclaim basic elements from junk metals. University of Texas scientists announced in 1974 that they had actually developed the first experimental fusion torch which gave an incredible heat output of 93 degrees Celsius. This is 5 times the previous hottest temperature for a contained gas and is twice the minimum heat needed for fusion, but it was held only for 1/50,000,000th of a second, instead of the 1 full second which would be required. It is curious to note here that Dr. Bernard Eastland is the patent holder of another unusual device, one that is associated with the HARP project at Gakona, Alaska. HARP, High Altitude Aerial Research Project, is allegedly linked to weather manipulation, one of the ways that Collins thinks that the ancients waged warfare. As far as holes in the ozone and weather manipulation go, Collins says, Soviet scientists have discussed and proposed at the United Nations a ban on developing new warfare ideas such as creating holes or windows in the ozone layer to bombard specific areas of the Earth with increased natural ultraviolet radiation, which would kill all life forms and turn the land into barren desert. Other ideas discussed at the meeting were the use of infrasound to demolish ships by creating acoustic fields on the sea, and hurling a huge chunk of rock into the sea with a cheap atomic device. The resultant tidal wave could demolish the coastal fringe of a country. Other tidal waves could be created by detonating nuclear devices at the frozen poles. Controlled floods, hurricanes, earthquakes, and droughts directed toward specific targets and cities are other possibilities. Finally, says Collins, although not a new method of warfare, incendiary weapons are now being developed to the point where chemical fireballs will be produced, which radiated thermal energy similar to that of an atomic bomb. Does California's Death Valley show evidence of an atomic war? In Secrets of the Lost Races, René Norbergen discusses the evidence for a cataclysmic war in the remote past that included the use of airships and weapons that vitrified stone cities. The most numerous vitrified remains in the New World are located in the western United States. In 1850, the American explorer, Captain Ives William Walker, was the first to view some of these ruins, situated in Death Valley. He discovered a city about a mile long, with the lines of the streets and the positions of the buildings still visible. At the center he found a huge rock between 20 to 30 feet high, with the remains of an enormous structure atop it. The southern side of both the rock and the building was melted and vitrified. Walker assumed that a volcano had been responsible for this phenomenon, but there is no volcano in the area. In addition, tectonic heat could not have caused such a liquefaction of the rock surface. An associate of Captain Walker, who followed up his initial exploration, commented, "The whole region between the rivers Gila and San Juan is covered with remains. The ruins of cities are to be found there which must be most extensive, and they are burnt out and vitrified in part, full of fused stones and craters caused by fires which were hot enough to liquefy rock or metal. There are paving stones and houses torn with monstrous cracks, as though they had been attacked by a giant's fire plow." These vitrified ruins in Death Valley sound fascinating, but do they really exist? There certainly is evidence of ancient civilizations in the area. In Titus Canyon, petroglyphs and inscriptions have been scratched into the walls by unknown prehistoric hands. Some experts think the graffiti might have been made by people who lived here long before the Indians we know of, because extant Indians know nothing of the glyphs, and indeed regard them with superstitious awe. Says Jim Brandon in Weird America, "Paiute legends tell of a city beneath Death Valley that they call Shin-Oav. Tom Wilson, an Indian guide in the 1920s, claimed that his grandfather had rediscovered the place by wandering into a miles-long labyrinth of caves beneath the valley floor. Eventually the Indian came to an underworld city where the people spoke an incomprehensible language and wore clothing made of leather. Wilson told this story after a prospector named White claimed he had fallen through the floor of an abandoned mine at Wingate Pass and into an unknown tunnel. White followed this into a series of rooms, where he found hundreds of leather-clad humanoid mummies. Gold bars were stacked like bricks and piled in bins. White claimed he had explored the caverns on 3 occasions. On one, his wife accompanied him, and on another his partner, Fred Thomason. However, none of them were able to relocate the opening to the cavern when they tried to take a group of archaeologists on a tour of the place. It seems one local character knew how to find the place. Brandon relates that Death Valley Scotty, an eccentric who spent millions building a castle estate in the area, was known to go prospecting when funds ran low. Death Valley Scotty would check out for a few days of wandering in the nearby Grapevine Mountains, bringing back suspiciously refined-looking gold that he claimed he had prospected. Many believe that he got his gold from the stacked gold bars in the tunnel system beneath Death Valley. Evidence of a lost civilization in Death Valley came in a bizarre report of caves and mummies in the Hot Citizen, a Nevada paper, on August 5, 1947. The story ran as follows. Expedition reports 9-foot skeletons. A band of amateur archaeologists announced today they have discovered a lost civilization of men 9 feet tall in Californian caverns. Howard E. Hill, spokesman for the expedition, said the civilization may be the fabled lost continent of Atlantis. The caves contain mummies of men and animals and implements of a culture 80,000 years old, but in some respects more advanced than ours, Hill said. He said the 32 caves covered a 180-square-mile area in California's Death Valley and southern Nevada. Archaeologists skeptical. This discovery may be more important than the unveiling of King Tut's tomb, he said. Professional archaeologists were skeptical of Hill's story. Los Angeles County Museum scientists pointed out that dinosaurs and tigers, which Hill said lay side by side in the caves, appeared on Earth 10 million to 13 million years apart. Hill said the caves were discovered in 1931 by Dr. F. Bruce Russell, a Beverly Hills physician who literally fell in while sinking a shaft for a mining claim. He tried for years to interest people in them, Hill said, but nobody believed him. Russell and several hobbyists incorporated after the war as Amazing Explorations Incorporated and started digging. Several caverns contained mummified remains of a race of men 8 to 9 feet tall, Hill said. They apparently wore a prehistoric zoot suit, a hair garment of medium length, jacket, and knee-length trousers. Cavern temple found. Another cavern contained their ritual hall with devices and markings similar to the Masonic order, he said. A long tunnel from this temple took the party into a room where, Hill said, well-preserved remains of dinosaurs, saber-toothed tigers, imperial elephants, and other extinct beasts were paired off in niches as if on display. Some catastrophe apparently drove the people into the caves, he said. All of the implements of their civilization were found, he said, including household utensils and stoves, which apparently cooked by radio waves. I know, he said, that you won't believe that. While of doubtful authenticity, this is an interesting story, to say the least. The last comment about cooking food with radio waves being unbelievable is ironic. That is the one thing that modern readers of the story could certainly believe was true, considering the widespread use of microwave ovens today. Who had heard of them in 1947? Sodom and Gomorrah meet Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Probably the most famous of all ancient Nukem stories is the well-known biblical tale of Sodom and Gomorrah. And the Lord said, because the cry of Sodom and Gomorrah is great, and because their sin is very grievous, then the Lord rained upon Sodom and upon Gomorrah brimstone and fire from the Lord out of heaven, and he overthrew those cities, and all the plain, and all the inhabitants of the cities, and that which grew upon the ground. But his, Lot's, wife, looked back from behind him, and she became a pillar of salt, and lo, the smoke of the country went up as the smoke of a furnace. Genesis. This biblical passage has come to epitomize the destructive power of God's wrath, visited on those places which sin. The Bible is very specific about the site of Sodom and Gomorrah, plus several other towns. They were in the Vale of Siddim, which was located at the southern end of the Salt Sea, now called the Dead Sea. Other towns in the area, according to the Bible, were Zoar, Admah, and Zeboim. As late as the Middle Ages, a town called Zoar existed in the area. The Dead Sea is 1,280 feet below sea level and an incredible 1,200 feet deep. The bottom of the sea is therefore about 2,500 feet below the level of the Mediterranean. Approximately 30% of the water of the Dead Sea consists of solid ingredients, mostly sodium chloride, i.e. cooking salt. Normal ocean water is only 3.3 to 4% salt. The Jordan and many smaller rivers empty themselves into this basin, which has not a solitary outlet. What its tributaries bring to it in the way of chemical substances remains deposited in the Dead Sea's 500 square miles. Evaporation under the broiling sun takes place on the surface of the sea at a rate of over 230 million cubic feet per day. Arab tradition has it that so many poisonous gases come out of the lake that birds could not fly across it, as they would die before reaching the other side. The Dead Sea was first explored in modern times in 1848, when W. F. Lynch, an American geologist, led an expedition. He brought ashore from his government research ship 2 metal boats which he fastened onto large-wheeled carts. Pulled by a long team of horses, Lynch's expedition reached the Dead Sea some months later. Lynch's team discovered that the traditions were correct in that a man could not sink in the sea. They also surveyed the lake, noting its unusual depth and the shallow area, or tongue, at the southern end of the lake. This area is thought to be where the Vale of Siddim was located and the 5 cities existed. It is possible to see entire forests of trees encrusted with salt beneath the water in this southern part of the lake. Standard historical theory on the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, such as in The Bible as History by Werner Keller, holds that the cities of the Vale of Siddim were destroyed when a plate movement caused the Great Rift Valley, of which the Dead Sea is a part, to shift, and the area at the southern end of the Dead Sea subsided. In the great earthquake, there were probably explosions, natural gases issuing forth, and brimstone falling like rain. This is likely to have happened about 2000 B.C., the time of Abraham and Lot, thinks Keller, though geologists place the event many thousands of years before this. Says Keller, "The Jordan Valley is only part of a huge fracture in the earth's crust. The path of this crack has meantime been accurately traced. It begins far north, several hundred miles beyond the borders of Palestine, at the foot of the Taurus Mountains in Asia Minor. In the south it runs from the south shore of the Dead Sea through the Wadi el-Araba to the Gulf of Aqaba, and only comes to an end beyond the Red Sea in Africa. At many points in this vast depression, signs of earlier volcanic activity are obvious. In the Galilean mountains, in the highlands of Transjordan, on the banks of the Yabok, a tributary of the Jordan, and on the Gulf of Aqaba are black basalt and lava. The subsidence released volcanic forces that had been lying dormant deep down along the whole length of the fracture. In the upper valleys of the Jordan near Bashan, there are still the towering craters of extinct volcanoes. Great stretches of lava and deep layers of basalt have been deposited on the limestone surface. From time immemorial, the area around this depression has been subject to earthquakes. There is repeated evidence of them, and the Bible itself records them. Did Sodom and Gomorrah sink when perhaps a part of the base of this huge fissure collapsed still further, to the accompaniment of earthquakes and volcanic eruptions? As for the pillars of salt, Keller says, "To the west of the southern shore and in the direction of the biblical land of the south, the Negev, stretches a ridge of hills about 150 feet high and 10 miles from north to south. Their slopes sparkle and glitter in the sunshine like diamonds. It is an odd phenomenon of nature. For the most part, this little range of hills consists of pure rock salt. The Arabs call it Jebel Ustum, an ancient name which preserves in it the word Sodom. Many blocks of salt have been worn away by the rain and have crashed downhill. They have odd shapes, and some of them stand on end, looking like statues. It is easy to imagine them suddenly seeming to come to life. These strange statues in salt remind us vividly of the biblical description of Lot's wife, who was turned into a pillar of salt. And everything in the neighborhood of the Salt Sea is even to this day quickly covered with a crust of salt. However, Keller himself admits that there is a very serious problem with this theory of a cataclysm sending the Vale of Siddim to the bottom of the Dead Sea. It must have happened many hundreds of thousands, even millions of years ago, at least according to most geologists. Says Keller, "In particular, we must remember there can be no question that the Jordan fissure was formed before about 4000 B.C. Indeed, according to the most recent presentation of the facts, the origin of the fissure dates back to the Oligocene, the third oldest stage of the Tertiary period. We thus have to think in terms not of thousands, but of millions of years. Violent volcanic activity connected with the Jordan fissure has been shown to have occurred since then, but even so we do not get any farther than the Pleistocene, which came to an end approximately 10,000 years ago. Certainly we do not come anywhere near to the third, still less the second millennium before Christ, the period, that is to say, in which the patriarchs are traditionally placed." In short, Keller is saying that any geological catastrophe that would have destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah would have had to have happened 1,000,000 years ago, or so geologists have told him. Keller says that geologists have not found any evidence of a recent catastrophe at the southern end of the Dead Sea, at least not for about 10,000 years. Says Keller, "In addition, it is precisely to the south of the Laysan Peninsula, where Sodom and Gomorrah are reported to have been annihilated, that the traces of former volcanic activity cease. In short, the proof in this area of a quite recent catastrophe which wiped out towns and was accompanied by violent volcanic activity is not provided by the findings of the geologists." So here is the problem. The Dead Sea area may have had a cataclysm that could be the origin of the Old Testament story. However, conservative uniformitarian geologists have said that any such earth changes must have occurred long before any sort of collective memory of the event could have occurred. In late 1999, a new theory was proposed by British Bible scholar Michael Sanders and an international team of researchers, who discovered what appear to be the salt-encrusted remains of ancient settlements on the seabed after several fraught weeks diving in a mini-submarine. Sanders told a television crew from BBC Channel 4, who made a documentary about the expedition, "There is a good chance that these mounds are covering up brick structures and are one of the lost cities of the plains, possibly even Sodom or Gomorrah, though I would have to examine the evidence. These Bible stories were handed down by word of mouth from generation to generation before they were written down, and there seems to be a great deal in this one." Mr. Sanders unearthed a map dating from 1650 which reinforced his belief that the sites of the two cities could be under the North Basin, rather than on the southern edge of the Dead Sea. He recruited Richard Slater, an American geologist and expert in deep-sea diving, to take him to the depths of the Dead Sea in the two-man Delta mini-submarine that was involved in the discovery of the sunken ocean liner, the Lusitania. Sanders's location for Sodom and Gomorrah in the deep northern part of the Dead Sea is even more at odds with history and geology than Keller's theories of the cities being at the shallow southern end. Therefore we come back to the popular theory that these cities were not destroyed in a geological cataclysm, but in a man-made, or extraterrestrial-made, apocalypse that was technological in nature. Were Sodom and Gomorrah attacked with atomic weapons, as were Hiroshima and Nagasaki? Researcher L.M. Lewis, in his book Footprints on the Sands of Time, maintains that Sodom and Gomorrah were both destroyed by atomic weapons, and says that the salt pillars and high salt content around the Dead Sea are evidence of a nuclear blast. Says Lewis, "When Hiroshima was being rebuilt, stretches of sandy soil were found to have been atomically changed into a substance resembling a glazed silicon permeated by a saline crystalloid. Little blocks of this were cut from the mass and sold to tourists as souvenirs of the town, and of atomic action. Had an even larger explosion pulverized every stone of every building, and had the complete city disappeared into thin air, there would still have been telltale indications of what had occurred on the outskirts of the area of devastation. At some points there would surely be a marked difference in the soil, or an atomic change in some object of note." Lewis maintains that if the pillars of salt at the end of the Dead Sea were ordinary salt, they would have disappeared with the periodic rains. Instead, these pillars are of a special harder salt, only created with a nuclear reaction, such as an atomic explosion. These pillars of salt have indeed lasted a long time. Not only were they present in ancient times, but are still standing today. Lewis quotes from the well-known Roman historian Josephus, who says in his History of the Jews, "But Lot's wife, continually turning back to view the city as she went from it, although God had forbidden her to do so, was changed into a pillar of salt. For I have seen it, and it remains to this day." Comments Lewis, "It should be emphasized that Flavius Josephus lived from 37 to approximately 100 A.D. As previously stated, Sodom was disintegrated in 1898 B.C. How amazing, then, that Josephus should actually have seen the human pillar of salt after it had stood for almost 2,000 years. If it had been ordinary salt, it would have disappeared with the first rains. Though there may have been many pillars of salt throughout history, Lewis thinks that the evidence supports an atomic blast. The atomic change of the soil upon which Lot's wife stood and that of the shore of Hiroshima have a similarity that cannot be denied. Both had undergone a sudden atomic conversion, which could only have been caused by the instant action of nuclear fission. As those things which equal the same thing must be equal to one another, it is difficult to escape the conviction that as Hiroshima was destroyed, so by similar means Sodom was disintegrated, and Lot's wife at the same moment atomically changed. Relying on the veracity of Josephus, the only conclusion that can be reached is that Sodom was destroyed by nuclear fission. The story of Sodom and Gomorrah is puzzling not just because of the destruction, but also because of the personalities involved, such as the angel warning Lot to leave the doomed cities. Was Lot warned before the cities were going to be nuked by extraterrestrials or humans with high-tech weapons? They warned Lot to get his family out, but his wife looked back and was blinded by the atomic flash. Perhaps her body was even atomically changed. At the southern end of the Dead Sea today is a modern chemical plant that looks like an alien base. Strange towers shoot up out of the desert. Bizarre buildings with domes and spires are covered with multicolored lights. One expects to see a flying saucer land at any moment. It is the Dead Sea Chemical Works. During the day it looks more normal, like an oil refinery or something. But at night, the lights that are strung about the facility make it seem otherworldly. This huge chemical plant is said to have an endless supply of valuable minerals with which to work, including radioactive salts. Are some of these chemicals the result of an ancient atomic blast? Atomic devastation, Indian style. Quotes from the Mahabharata. Various omens appeared among the gods. Winds blew, meteors fell in thousands. Thunder rolled through a cloudless sky. There he saw a wheel with a rim as sharp as a razor whirling around the soma. Then, taking the soma, he broke the whirling machine. Drona called Arjuna and said, "Accept from me this irresistible weapon called Brahmasira. But you must promise never to use it against a human foe, for if you did it might destroy the world. If any foe who is not a human attacks you, you may use it against him in battle. None but you deserves the celestial weapon that I give you." This is a curious statement, as what other kind of foe different from a human might there have been? Are we talking about an interplanetary war? "I shall fight you with a celestial weapon given to me by Drona." He then hurled the blazing weapon. At last they came to blows, and seizing their maces, struck each other. They fell like falling suns. These huge animals, elephants, like mountains, struck by Bhima's mace, fell with their heads broken, fell upon the ground like cliffs loosened by thunder. Bhima took him by the arm and dragged him away to an open place, where they began to fight like two elephants mad with rage. The dust they raised resembled the smoke of a forest fire. It covered their bodies so that they looked like swaying cliffs wreathed in mist. Arjuna and Krishna rode to and fro in their chariots on either side of the forest, and drove back the creatures which tried to escape. Thousands of animals were burnt. Pools and lakes began to boil. The flames even reached heaven. Indra, without loss of time, set out for Khandava and covered the sky with masses of clouds. The rain poured down, but it was dried in mid-air by the heat. These verses are from the Mahabharata, written in ancient Dravidian, then later in Sanskrit, describing horrific wars fought long before the recorder's lifetime. Several historical records claim that Indian culture has been around for literally tens of thousands of years. Yet until 1920 all the experts agreed that the origins of the Indian civilization should be placed within a few hundred years of Alexander the Great's expedition to the subcontinent in 327 BC. However, that was before several great cities like Harappa and Mohenjo-Daro, Mound of the Dead, were discovered and excavated, including Kotdiji, Kalibanga, and Lothal. Lothal, a former port city now miles from the ocean, was discovered in Gujarat, western India, just in the late 20th century. The discoveries of these cities forced archaeologists to push the dates for the origin of Indian civilization back thousands of years, just as Indians themselves insisted. A wonder to modern-day researchers, the cities are highly developed and advanced. The way that each city is laid out in regular blocks with streets crossing each other at right angles, and the entire city laid out in sections, causes archaeologists to believe that the cities were conceived as a whole before they were built, a remarkable early example of city planning. Even more remarkable is that the plumbing sewage systems throughout the large cities are so sophisticated. They are superior to those found in Pakistan, India, and many Asian countries today. Sewers were covered, and most homes had private toilets and running water. Furthermore, the water and sewage systems were kept well separated. This advanced culture had its own writing, which has never been deciphered. The people used personalized clay seals, much as the Chinese still do today, to officialize documents and letters. Some of the seals found contain figures of animals that are unknown to us today, including an extinct form of the Brahma bull. Archaeologists really have no idea who the builders were, but attempts to date the ruins, which they ascribe to the Indus Valley civilization, also called Harappan, have come up with something like 2500 BC and older. Radiation from the wars apparently fought in the area may have thrown off any dating techniques. The Rama Empire, described in the Mahabharata and Ramayana, was supposedly contemporaneous with the great cultures of Atlantis and Osiris in the west. Atlantis, well known from Plato's writings and ancient Egyptian records, apparently existed in the mid-Atlantic and was a very highly technological and patriarchal civilization. As we have noted, the Osirian civilization existed in the Mediterranean basin and North Africa, according to esoteric doctrine and archaeological evidence. The Osirian civilization is generally known as pre-dynastic Egypt, and was flooded when Atlantis sank and the Mediterranean began to fill up with water. The Rama Empire flourished during the same period, according to esoteric tradition, fading out in the millennium after the destruction of the Atlantean continent. As noted before, the ancient Indian epics describe a series of horrific wars which could have been between ancient India and Atlantis, or perhaps a third party in the Gobi region of western China. The Mahabharata and the Drona Parva, another ancient Indian epic, speak of the war and of the weapons used: great fireballs that could destroy a whole city, Kapila's glance, which could burn 50,000 men to ashes in seconds, and flying spears that could ruin whole cities full of forts. The Rama Empire was started by the Nagas, Nakals, who had come into India from Burma, and ultimately from the motherland to the east, or so Colonel James Churchward was told. After settling in the Deccan Plateau in northern India, they made their capital in the ancient city of Deccan, where today the modern city of Nagpur stands. The empire of the Nagas apparently began to extend all over northern India, to include the cities of Harappa, Mohenjo-Daro, and Kotdiji, now in Pakistan, and Lothal, Kalibanga, Mathura, and possibly other cities, such as Benares, Ayodhya, and Pataliputra. These cities were led by great teachers or masters who were the benevolent aristocracy of the Rama civilization. Today they are generally called priest-kings of the Indus Valley civilization, and a number of statues of these so-called gods have been discovered. In reality, these were apparently men whose mental psychic powers were of a degree that seems incredible to most people of today. It was at the height of power for both the Rama Empire and Atlantis that the war allegedly broke out, seemingly because of Atlantis's attempt to subjugate Rama. According to the Lemurian Fellowship lesson materials, the populace surrounding Mu, Lemuria, which predated the other civilizations, had eventually split into two opposing factions, those who prized practicality and those who prized spirituality. The citizenry, or educated elite, of Mu itself were balanced equally in these two qualities. The citizenry encouraged the other groups to emigrate to uninhabited lands. Those that prized practicality emigrated to the Poseid island group, Atlantis, and those that prized spirituality eventually ended up in India. The Atlanteans, a patriarchal civilization with an extremely materialistic, technology-oriented culture, deemed themselves the masters of the world, and eventually sent a well-equipped army to India in order to subjugate the empire and bring it under the suzerainty of Atlantis. One account of the battle related by the Lemurian Fellowship in its lessons tells how the Rama Empire priest-kings defeated the Atlanteans. Equipped with a formidable force and a fantastic array of weapons, the Atlanteans landed in their Velaxy outside of one of the Rama cities, got their troops in order, and sent a message to the ruling priest-king of the city that he should surrender. The priest-king sent word back to the Atlantean general, "We of India have no quarrel with you of Atlantis. We ask only that we be permitted to follow our own way of life." Regarding the ruler's mild request as a confession of weakness, and expecting an easy victory, as the Rama Empire did not possess the technology of war nor the aggressiveness of the Atlanteans, the Atlantean general sent another message. "We shall not destroy your land with the mighty weapons at our command, provided you pay sufficient tribute and accept the rulership of Atlantis." The priest-king of the city responded humbly again, seeking to avert war. "We of India do not believe in war and strife, peace being our ideal. Neither would we destroy you or your soldiers, who but follow orders. However, if you persist in your determination to attack us without cause, and merely for the purpose of conquest, you will leave us no recourse but to destroy you and all of your leaders. Depart, and leave us in peace." Arrogantly, the Atlanteans did not believe that the Indians had the power to stop them, certainly not by technical means. At dawn the Atlantean army began to march on the city. From a high viewpoint the priest-king sadly watched the army advance. Then he raised his arms heavenward and, using a mental technique perhaps known today by certain very knowledgeable persons, he caused the general, and then each officer in order of rank, to drop dead in his tracks, probably of some sort of heart failure. In a panic and without leaders, the remaining Atlantean force fled to the waiting Velaxy and retreated in terror to Atlantis. Of the sieged Rama city, not one man was lost. While this may be nothing but fanciful conjecture, the Indian epics go on to tell the rest of the horrible story, and things do not turn out well for Rama. Atlantis, assuming the above story is true, was not pleased at the humiliating defeat, and therefore used its most powerful and destructive weapon, probably an atomic weapon. These are verses from the ancient Mahabharata. "It was a single projectile, charged with all the power of the universe. An incandescent column of smoke and flame as bright as the 1,000 suns rose in all its splendor. It was an unknown weapon, an iron thunderbolt, a gigantic messenger of death, which reduced to ashes the entire race of the Vrishnis and the Andakas. The corpses were so burned as to be unrecognizable. The hair and nails fell out, pottery broke without apparent cause, and the birds turned white. After a few hours all foodstuffs were infected. To escape from this fire, the soldiers threw themselves in streams to wash themselves and their equipment." In the way that we traditionally view ancient history, it seems absolutely incredible that there was an atomic war approximately 10,000 years ago. And yet of what else could the Mahabharata be speaking? Perhaps this is just a poetic way to describe cavemen clubbing each other to death. After all, that is what we are told the ancient past was like. Until the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, Modern mankind could not imagine any weapon as horrible and devastating as those described in the ancient Indian texts. Yet they very accurately describe the effects of an atomic explosion. Radioactive poisoning will make hair and nails fall out. Immersing one's self in water is the only respite, though not a cure. Interestingly, Dr. J. Robert Oppenheimer, the father of the H-bomb, is known to be familiar with ancient Sanskrit literature. In an interview conducted after he watched the first atomic test, he quotes from the Bhagavad Gita, "Now I've become death, the destroyer of worlds. I suppose we all felt that way." When asked in an interview at Rochester University 7 years after the Alamogordo nuclear test whether that was the first atomic bomb ever to be detonated, his reply was, "Well, yes, in modern history." The Doom of Mohenjo-Daro. Incredible as it may seem, archaeologists have found evidence in India indicating that some cities were destroyed in atomic explosions. When excavations of Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa reached the street level, they discovered scattered skeletons about the cities, many holding hands and sprawling in the streets, as if some instant horrible doom had taken place. I mean, people are just lying, unburied in the streets of the city. And these skeletons are thousands of years old, even by traditional archaeological standards. What could cause such a thing? Why did the bodies not decay or get eaten by wild animals? Furthermore, there is no apparent cause of a violent death, heads hacked off, bashed in, etc. These skeletons are among the most radioactive ever found, on par with those at Nagasaki and Hiroshima. Soviet scholars have found a skeleton at one site that had a radioactive level 50 times greater than normal. The Russian archaeologist A. Gorbovsky mentions the high incidence of radiation associated with the skeletons in his 1966 book, Riddles of Ancient History. Furthermore, thousands of fused lumps, christened black stones, have been found at Mohenjo-Daro. These appear to be fragments of clay vessels that melted together in extreme heat. Other cities have been found in northern India that show indications of explosions of great magnitude. One such city, found between the Ganges and the mountains of Rajmahal, seems to have been subjected to intense heat. Huge masses of walls and foundations of the ancient city are fused together, literally vitrified. Since there is no indication of a volcanic eruption at Mohenjo-Daro or at the other cities, the intense heat to melt clay vessels can only be explained by an atomic blast or some other unknown weapon. The cities were wiped out entirely. If we accept the Lemurian fellowship stories as fact, then Atlantis wanted to waste no more time with the priest-kings of Rama and their mental tricks. In terrifying revenge, they utterly destroyed the Rama Empire, leaving no country to even pay tribute to them. The area around the cities of Harappa and Mohenjo-Daro are desolate deserts, though agriculture takes place to a limited extent in the vicinity today. It is said in esoteric literature that Atlantis at the same time, or shortly afterwards, also attempted to subjugate a civilization extant in the area of the Gobi Desert, which was then a fertile plain. By using so-called scalar wave weaponry and firing through the center of the earth, they wiped out their adversaries, and possibly at the same time did themselves in. Much speculation naturally exists in connection with remote history. We may never actually know the complete truth, though ancient texts are certainly a good start. Atlantis met its own doom, according to Plato, by sinking into the ocean in a mighty cataclysm, not too long after the war with the Rama Empire, I imagine. Kashmir is also connected with the fantastic war in ancient times that destroyed the Rama Empire. The massive ruins of a temple called Parshashpur can be found just outside Srinagar. It is a scene of total destruction. Huge blocks of stone are scattered about a wide area, giving the impression of explosive annihilation. Was Parshashpur destroyed by some fantastic weapon during one of the horrendous battles detailed in the Mahabharata? Another curious sign of an ancient nuclear war in India is a giant crater near Bombay. India's nearly circular 2,154-meter diameter Lonar crater, located 400 kilometers northeast of Bombay and aged at less than 50,000 years old, could be related to nuclear warfare of antiquity. No trace of any meteoric, etc. material has been found at the site or in the vicinity, while it is the world's only known impact crater in basalt. Indications of great shock from a pressure exceeding 600,000 atmospheres and intense abrupt heat, indicated by basalt glass spherules, can be ascertained at the site. Orthodoxy cannot, of course, concede nuclear possibilities for such craters, even in the absence of any material meteorite or related evidence. If such geologically recent craters as the Lonar were of meteoric origin, why then do such tremendous meteorites not fall today? The Earth's atmosphere 50,000 years ago probably was no different from today's. So a lighter atmosphere cannot be advanced as a hypothesis to attempt to explain an immense meteorite size, which of course would be considerably reduced by heat oxidization within a gaseously heavier atmosphere. A theory was advanced by American space consultant Pat Frank to the effect that some of the huge craters on Earth may in fact be scars from ancient nuclear explosions. The echoes of ancient atomic warfare in South Asia continue to this day, with India and Pakistan currently threatening each other. Modern India is proud of their nukes, likening them to Rama's arrow. Similarly, Pakistan would love to use its Islamic bomb on India. Ironically, Kashmir, possibly the site of an earlier atomic war, is the focus of this conflict. Will the past repeat itself in Pakistan and India? In the crazy world of the new millennium and its underground tunnels, secret bases, UFOs, and nuclear weapons, there is always the possibility that this has all happened before. Maybe it has. Déjà vu. 7. The Earth as a giant power plant. The priests told me that the Great Pyramid embodied all the wonders of physics. Herodotus, 350 B.C. You gotta know the rules before you can break 'em, otherwise it's just no fun. Sonny Crockett, Miami Vice. The Giza Pyramid Complex. The structures of the Giza Plateau in Egypt are perhaps the most famous examples of technological wonders built by the ancients using technologies we can neither understand nor duplicate today. Who built these monuments, how and why, has been the focus of immense speculation over the years. The Sphinx is one of the three most controversial structures in Egypt, along with the Great Pyramid and the Osirion at Abydos. Carved out of solid rock, the Sphinx seems to typify the mystery of Egypt as it gazes silently out away from the pyramids. The age of the Sphinx is a matter of great debate. The body is severely eroded, though the Egyptian government is now reconstructing it. What could have caused this heavy decay? The controversial German Egyptologist Schwaller de Lubitsch observed that the dramatically severe erosion on the body could not be the result of wind and sand, as universally assumed, but was rather the result of water. Geologists agree that in the not-so-distant past, Egypt was subjected to severe flooding. This period is usually held to coincide with the melting of the ice from the last ice age, circa 15,000 to 10,000 B.C. This would indicate that the Sphinx was already constructed by this time, and would make it easily the oldest structure in Egypt, built long before the recognized Egyptian civilization began. Suddenly we are back to the tales of the ancient Osirian Empire, Atlantis, and the cataclysmic pole shifts that have rocked our planet every 10,000 years or so. The Sphinx is often said to be the likeness of the pharaoh Khephren, of whom several statues, one in the form of a sphinx, were found upside down in the temple next to the Sphinx. The Sphinx, in fact, is said to have been recarved at least once, and its head is unnaturally small for its body, indicating that it once had a much larger head. Perhaps the pharaoh Khephren had the Sphinx recarved in his likeness during his lifetime. The Valley Temple of Khephren next to the Sphinx is also an unusual structure. It is constructed of huge granite and limestone blocks weighing up to 100 tons apiece. No inscriptions of any kind are to be found in the temple, and the blocks are perfectly fitted together in a curious jigsaw pattern that interlocks the blocks. As has been noted previously, this is a trademark of the builders, a type of megalithic construction that is not only extremely difficult to make, but also difficult to tear down. Because the blocks are interlocked, they cannot shear like bricks or square blocks of masonry. It is especially interesting to compare the construction technique found at the Valley Temple of Khephren to that found at Cuzco, Sacsayhuaman, Ollantaytambo, and even Machu Picchu. There are also said to be secret passages beneath the Giza Plateau. These passages go to the pyramids, allegedly starting from the Sphinx, and are part of the ancient mystery schools of Egypt. A strange shaft in the Giza Plateau between the Pyramid of Khephren and the Sphinx is known as Campbell's Tomb, or Campbell's Well. This shaft is now blocked by a grate, but one can still look down it. The shaft is about 15 feet square on each side and about 100 feet deep. On each side of the walls one can see numerous tunnels, passages, and doors cut into the solid rock. These passageways are part of the tunnel system that goes beneath the Giza Plateau. It is purposely dangerous to attempt to reach the pyramids or the secret underground rooms that can be found in the tunnels. Their existence, and what lies in them, is a matter of legend and prophecy. It has been suggested that a secret library from Atlantis is hidden somewhere inside, underneath or nearby the pyramids of Giza. This library is generally called the Ancient Hall of Records. According to some, the Hall of Records preserved ancient knowledge in the form of encoded quartz crystals, much like a hologram might be encoded by a laser today. Also in these secret chambers, sealed from the rest of mankind during the dark age of Egyptian history, when the evil priesthoods sought to control mankind, are supposedly machines and devices from that forgotten age. There is the belief by some that the Ark of the Covenant was contained inside the Great Pyramid for some time, and then taken by Moses when the Israelites split for the Promised Land. The pyramids of the Giza Plateau have been recognized as feats of engineering wonder since time immemorial. Herodotus, the Greek historian of the 1st century B.C., claims that he was told by priests 2,000 years or more after the Great Pyramid's construction that teams of 10,000 men each labored for 10 years to build a ramp for the blocks, then another 20 years to build the pyramid, and finally a further 10 years to put the casing stones on the pyramid, starting from the top down. Herodotus claimed that Cheops financed the construction by having his own daughter work as a prostitute. An inscription read to Herodotus at the base of the pyramid by priests told of the number of onions and radishes it took to feed the laborers. Yet it appears that Herodotus was being told a story. No trace of a ramp has actually been discovered. Most scholars believe that the ramp Herodotus refers to is the causeway leading up from the Nile past the Sphinx. All the pyramids had this causeway leading up to them, but it apparently had nothing to do with their construction. There are no actual wall drawings of a pyramid being constructed, but there are drawings that portray the transport of gigantic obelisks and giant statues weighing more than 100 tons by men pulling sleds. According to John Anthony West, even though it was possible to muster up enough labor to build the pyramids over time, some sort of lifting device would have to have been employed, which so far no one has come up with. Other engineers claim that no lifting device was needed, and that the ramp merely had to reach the top of the pyramid. However, a Danish engineer named P. Garda Hansen has calculated that such a ramp would require 17.5 million cubic yards of material, 7 times more than that used in the building of the pyramid itself. Garda Hansen believes that a ramp going halfway up the pyramid would be better, but it would still be necessary to use a lifting device, which brings us back to the old problem. The placing of the limestone casing stones, which weigh up to 10 tons or more, is an even bigger problem, as they are cut and fitted with such precision. Cheops did not even sign his own pyramid. The only marks in the pyramid are quarry marks on granite blocks on the inside of the pyramid. These were only discovered with the tearing apart of the pyramid, and were never meant to be seen. One possibility is the ingenious theory that the pyramid itself was a hydraulic pump, and the blocks were floated into place on rafts from nearby Lake Maurice. Another theory that has a certain attraction to mystics is that the blocks were levitated, using what the Egyptians called ma'at, a force of mind power akin to the Sanskrit mana power of the mind. Was the Great Pyramid poured into place? One curious theory of the pyramids is postulated by an authority on ancient construction techniques named Dr. Joseph Davidovits. Davidovits has been saying over the last several years that the Great Pyramid of Egypt, as well as other pyramids in Egypt, was not constructed out of cut stone as has always been assumed. Davidovits believes that the large blocks were actually poured into place, and that they are an advanced and ingenious form of synthetic stone that was cast on the spot, like concrete. Davidovits reported on his research at a meeting of the American Chemical Society in the mid-1980s. He is the founder and director of the Institute for Applied Archaeological Sciences, located near Miami. He is also the author of the 1988 book The Pyramids, An Enigma Solved. Davidovits claims that a new deciphering of an ancient hieroglyphic text has provided some direct information about pyramid construction, and that it supports his theory that synthetic stone was the construction material. The text, called the Famina Stela, was discovered 100 years ago on an island near Elephantine, Egypt. It consists of 2,600 hieroglyphs, about 650 of which have been interpreted as dealing with stone fabrication techniques. The text claims that an Egyptian god gave the instructions for making synthetic stone to Pharaoh Zoser, who is said to have built the first pyramid in 2750 BC. Included were a list of 29 minerals that could be processed with crushed limestone and other natural aggregates into a synthetic stone for use in the building of temples and pyramids. Like the chemists of the 17th and 18th centuries, the Egyptians named these minerals according to their physical properties. The materials were called onion ore, garlic ore, and horseradish ore because of their distinctive smells. Davidovits believes the minerals in the ores contained arsenic. Other ingredients for making synthetic stone, phosphates from bones or dung, Nile silt, limestone, and quartz were also readily available. According to the theory, the ingredients were mixed with water and placed into wooden forms similar to those used for concrete. Davidovits said the cement used in the pyramid stone binds the aggregate and other ingredients together chemically, in a process similar to that involved in the formation of natural stone. Thus, pyramid stone is extremely difficult to distinguish from natural stone. Portland cement, by contrast, involves mechanical rather than molecular bonding of its ingredients. Also, Egyptian cement would last for thousands of years, while ordinary cement has an average lifespan of only 150 years. Organic fibers, having accidentally fallen into the mixture, have been found in the stone blocks of the Great Pyramid, claims Davidovits. What was the function of the pyramids? Actually, though it is usually said that the pyramids were tombs for the pharaohs, the evidence is generally against this theory. Startling as it may seem, no Egyptian mummy was ever found in a pyramid. Many Egyptian mummies have been found, but not inside pyramids. Rather, they have been found in underground vaults and tunnels, such as those in the Valley of the Kings where Tutankhamun was found. As the normally traditional archaeologist Kurt Mendelsohn says in his book The Riddle of the Pyramids, while the funerary function of the pyramids cannot be doubted, it is rather more difficult to prove that the pharaohs were ever buried inside them. Leaving out Zoser's step pyramid with its unique burial chambers, the 9 remaining pyramids contain no more than 3 authentic sarcophagi. These are distributed over no fewer than 14 tomb chambers. Petrie has shown that the lidless sarcophagus in the Khufu, Cheops pyramid had been put into the king's chamber before the latter was roofed over, since it is too large to pass through the entrance passage. One would like to know what has happened to the missing sarcophagi. The robbers might have smashed their lids, but they would hardly have taken the trouble to steal a smashed sarcophagus. In spite of careful search, no chips of broken sarcophagi have been found in any of the pyramid passages or chambers. Moreover, it has to be remembered that from the Medum pyramid onward, the entrance was well above ground level. At the bent pyramid, even the lower corridor is located 12 meters above the base, and bringing a heavy sarcophagus in or out would have necessitated the use of a substantial ramp. The fact that sarcophagi in the Khufu and Khafra pyramids were found empty is easily explained as the work of intruders, but the empty sarcophagi of Sekhmet, Queen Hetepheres, and a third one in a shaft under the step pyramid pose a different problem. They were all left undisturbed since early antiquity. As these burials were without a corpse, we are almost driven to the conclusion that something other than a human body may have been ritually entombed. We have already referred to the fact that Snefru seems to have had 2 or even 3 large pyramids, and he can hardly have been buried in all of them. While very few people will dispute that the pyramids had some connection with the afterlife of the pharaoh, the general statement that the pharaohs were buried in them is by no means undisputable. Quite possibly each pyramid once housed the body of the pharaoh, but there also exists an unpleasantly large number of factors that speak against it. It is on the basis of these complexities and contradictions that Egyptologists had to try and find a solution to the most difficult problem of all. Why were these immense pyramids built in the first place? If the pyramids weren't tombs, what were they? There is the theory that they were astronomical observatories. Another idea is that the pyramids, especially the Great Pyramid, were geodetic markers and time capsules, in the sense that higher knowledge, such as sophisticated geometry and mathematics, were incorporated into the structures. Others have claimed that the pyramids were centers of initiation. Then, of course, there is always pyramid energy. The word pyramid is in fact Greek for fire in the center. The Giza Power Plant. The belief that the pyramids were a device for tapping the energy of the Van Allen belt, where the bulk of the pyramid served as a protective baffle, like insulation around an electric cable, is perhaps the most incredible suggestion of all. This theory is now championed by British engineer Christopher Dunn. Dunn is the author of the 1998 book The Giza Power Plant, Technologies of Ancient Egypt. In this book, Dunn outlines his theories and gives evidence for advanced machining and engineering knowledge in ancient Egypt. Dunn claims that the earth may be a giant power plant, and the many pyramids, obelisks, and megalithic standing stones may be part of this great energy system. He says that the Great Pyramid was a giant power plant, and that harmonic resonators were housed in slots above the king's chamber. He also theorized that there was a hydrogen explosion inside the king's chamber that shut down the power plant's operation. In August 1984, Analog magazine published Dunn's article, Advanced Machining in Ancient Egypt. It was a study of the book Pyramids and Temples of Giza, written by Sir William Flinders Petrie. Dunn is convinced that sophisticated machining was used in certain cases. Says Dunn, "Since the article's publication, I have visited Egypt twice, and with each visit I leave with more respect for the ancient pyramid builders. While in Egypt in 1986, I visited the Cairo Museum and gave a copy of my article, along with a business card, to the director of the museum. He thanked me kindly, threw it in a drawer to join other sundry material, and turned away. Another Egyptologist led me to the tool room to educate me in the methods of the ancient masons by showing me a few cases that housed primitive copper tools. I asked my host about the cutting of granite, for this was the focus of my article. He explained that the ancient Egyptians cut a slot in the granite, inserted wooden wedges, and then soaked them with water. The wood swelled, creating pressure that split the rock. Splitting rock is vastly different than machining it, and he did not explain how copper instruments were able to cut granite. But he was so enthusiastic with his dissertation that I did not interrupt. To prove his argument, he walked me over to a nearby travel agent, encouraging me to buy airplane tickets to Aswan, where, he said, the evidence is clear. I must, he insisted, see the quarry marks there, as well as the unfinished obelisk. Dutifully I bought the tickets and arrived at Aswan the next day. After learning some of the Egyptian customs, I got the impression that this was not the first time that my Egyptologist friend had made that quarry marks at Aswan trip to the travel agent. The quarry marks I saw there did not satisfy me that the methods described were the only means by which the pyramid builders quarried their drill hole at Aswan Rock. There is a large, round hole drilled into the bedrock hillside that measures approximately 12 inches in diameter and 3 feet deep that is located in the channel, which runs the length of the estimated 3,000-ton obelisk. The hole was drilled at an angle with the top intruding into the channel space. The ancients may have used drills to remove material from the perimeter of the obelisk, knocked out the webs between the holes, and then removed the cusps. Dunn says that archaeology is largely the study of history's tool-makers, and archaeologists understand a society's level of advancement with tools and artifacts. The hammer was probably the first tool ever invented, and hammers have forged some elegant and beautiful artifacts. Ever since man first learned that he could effect profound changes in his environment by applying force with a reasonable degree of accuracy, the development of tools has been a continuous and fascinating aspect of human endeavor. Dunn says that the Great Pyramid leads a long list of artifacts that have been misunderstood and misinterpreted by archaeologists, who have promoted theories and methods that are based on a collection of tools that they struggle with to replace the most simple aspects of the work. Says Dunn, for the most part, primitive tools that are discovered are considered contemporaneous with the artifacts of the same period. Yet during this period in Egyptian history, artifacts were produced in prolific number, with no tools surviving to explain their creation. The ancient Egyptians created artifacts that cannot be explained in simple terms. These tools do not fully represent the state of the art that is evident in the artifacts. There are some intriguing objects that survived after this civilization, and in spite of its most visible and impressive monuments, we have only a sketchy understanding of the full scope of its technology. The tools displayed by Egyptologists as instruments for the creation of many of these incredible artifacts are physically incapable of reproducing them. After standing in awe before these engineering marvels, and then being shown a paltry collection of copper implements in the tool case at the Cairo Museum, one comes away bemused and frustrated. Dunn claims that the British Egyptologist Sir William Flinders Petrie also recognized that these tools were insufficient. He explored this anomaly thoroughly in Pyramids and Temples of Giza, and expressed amazement about the methods the ancient Egyptians used to cut hard igneous rocks. He credited them with methods that we are only now coming to understand. Says Dunn, I'm not an Egyptologist. I'm a technologist. I do not have much interest in who died when, whom they may have taken with them, and where they went to. No lack of respect is intended for the mountain of work and the millions of hours of study conducted on this subject by intelligent scholars, professional and amateur. But my interest, thus my focus, is elsewhere. When I look at an artifact to investigate how it was manufactured, I am not concerned about its history or chronology. Having spent most of my career working with the machinery that actually creates modern artifacts, such as jet engine components, I am able to analyze and determine how an artifact was created. I have also had training and experience in some non-conventional manufacturing methods, such as laser processing and electrical discharge machining. Having said that, I should state that, contrary to some popular speculations, I have not seen the evidence of laser for cutting on the Egyptian rocks. Still, there is evidence for other non-conventional machining methods, as well as more sophisticated conventional-type sawing, lathe, and milling practices. Undoubtedly, some of the artifacts that Petrie was studying were produced using lathes. There is also evidence of clearly defined lathe tool marks on some sarcophagi lids. The Cairo Museum contains enough evidence that will prove that the ancient Egyptians used highly sophisticated manufacturing methods, once it's properly analyzed. There are several artifacts that almost undeniably indicate machinery power being used by the pyramid builders. These artifacts, scrutinized by William Flinders Petrie, are all fragments of extremely hard igneous rock. These pieces of granite and diorite exhibit marks that are the same as those resulting from cutting hard igneous rock with modern machinery. It is shocking that Petrie's studies of these fragments have not attracted greater attention, for there is unmistakable evidence of machine tooling methods. It will probably surprise many people to know that evidence proving that the ancient Egyptians used tools such as straight saws, circular saws, and even lathes has been recognized for over a century. The lathe is the father of all machine tools in existence, and Petrie submits evidence showing that not only were lathes used by the ancient Egyptians, but they performed tasks which would by today's standards be considered impossible without highly developed specialized techniques, such as cutting concave and convex spherical radii without splintering the material. While digging through the ruins of ancient civilizations, would archaeologists instantly recognize the work of machine tools by the kind of marks made on the material, or the configuration of the piece at which they were looking? Fortunately, one archaeologist had the perception and knowledge to recognize such marks, and although at the time Petrie's findings were published, the machining industry was in its infancy, the growth in the industry since then warrants a new look at his findings. Continues Dunn. Having worked with copper on numerous occasions, and having hardened it in the manner suggested above, this statement struck me as being entirely ridiculous. You can certainly work hardened copper by striking it repeatedly or even by bending it. However, after a specific hardness has been reached, the copper will begin to split and break apart. This is why, when working with copper to any great extent, it has to be periodically annealed or softened, if you want to keep it in one piece. Even after hardening in such a way, the copper will not be able to cut granite. The hardest copper alloy in existence today is beryllium copper. There is no evidence to suggest that the ancient Egyptians possessed this alloy, but even if they did, this alloy is not hard enough to cut granite. Copper has predominantly been described as the only metal available at the time the Great Pyramid was built. Consequently, it would follow that all work must have sprung from the able use of this basic metallic element. We may be entirely wrong, however, even in the basic assumption that copper was the only metal available to the ancient Egyptians. For another little-known fact about the pyramid builders is that they were iron makers as well. Without going back in time and interviewing the craftsmen who worked on the pyramids, we will probably never know for sure what materials their tools were made of. Any debate of the subject would be futile, for until the proof is at hand, no satisfactory conclusion can be reached. However, the manner in which the masons used their tools can be discussed, and perhaps if we compare current methods of cutting granite with the finished product, i.e. the granite coffers, there may be some basis on which to draw a parallel. Today's granite cutting methods include the use of wire saws and an abrasive, usually silicon carbide, which has a hardness comparable with diamond, and therefore is hard enough to cut through the quartz crystal in the granite. The wire is a continuous loop that is held by two wheels, one of the wheels being the driver. Between the wheels, which can vary in distance depending on the size of the machine, the granite is cut by being pushed against the wire or by being held firmly and allowing the wire to feed through it. The wire does not cut the granite, but is designed to effectively hold the silicon carbide grit that does the actual cutting. By looking at the shapes of the cuts that were made in the basalt items 3B and 5B, one could certainly speculate that a wire saw had been used and left its imprint in the rock. The full radius at the bottom of the cut is exactly the shape that would be left by such a saw. Mr. John Barta, of the John Barta Company, informed me that the wire saws used in quarry mills today cut through granite with great rapidity. Mr. Barta told me that the wire saws with silicon carbide cut through the granite like it is butter. Out of interest, I asked Mr. Barta what he thought of the copper chisel theory. Mr. Barta, possessing an excellent sense of humor, came forth with some jocular remarks regarding the practicality of such an idea. If the ancient Egyptians had indeed used wire saws for cutting hard rock, were these saws powered by hand or machine? With my experience in machine shops and the countless number of times I have had to use a saw, both hand saws and power saws, there appears to be strong evidence that, in at least some instances, the latter method was used. Sir William Petree's observations bear out what Dunn is saying. The following are his notes on the coffer inside the king's chamber in the Great Pyramid. On the end of the coffer is a place near the west side where the saw was run too deep into the granite and was backed out again by the masons. But this fresh start they made still too deep, and 2 inches lower they backed out a second time, having cut out more than 1/10 of an inch deeper than they had intended. The following concerns the coffer inside the second pyramid. The coffer is well polished, not only inside but all over the outside, even though it was nearly all bedded into the floor, with the blocks plastered against it. The bottom is left rough, and shows that it was sawn and afterwards dressed down to the intended height. But in sawing it, the saw was run too deep and then backed out. It was therefore not dressed down all over the bottom, the worst part of the sawing being cut 0.2 inches deeper than the dressed part. This is the only error of workmanship in the whole of it. It is polished all over the sides, in and out, and is not left with the saw lines visible on it like the Great Pyramid coffer. Petree estimated that a pressure of 1 to 2 tons on jeweled-tipped bronze saws would have been necessary to cut through the extremely hard granite. If we agree with these estimates as well as with the methods proposed by Egyptologists regarding the construction of the pyramids, then a severe inequity can be discerned between the two. Says Dunn, so far Egyptologists have not given credence to any speculation that suggests that the builders of the pyramid might have used machines instead of manpower in this massive construction project. In fact, they do not give the pyramid builders the intelligence to have developed and used the simple wheel. It is quite remarkable that a culture which possessed sufficient technical ability to make a lathe and progressed from there to develop a technique that enabled them to machine radii in hard diorite, would not have thought of the wheel before this. Petree logically assumes that the granite coffers found in the Giza pyramids were marked prior to being cut. The workmen were given a guideline with which to work. The accuracy exhibited in the dimensions of the coffers confirms this, plus the fact that guidelines of some sort would have been necessary to alert the masons of their error. While no one can say with certainty how the granite coffers were cut, the saw marks in the granite have certain characteristics which suggests that they were not the result of hand sawing. If there was not evidence to the contrary, I might agree that the manufacturing of the granite coffers in the Great Pyramid and the Second Pyramid could quite possibly have been achieved using pure manpower and a tremendous amount of time. It is extremely unlikely that a team of masons, operating a 9-foot hand saw, would be cutting through hard granite fast enough that they would pass their guideline before noticing the error. To then back the saw out and repeat the same error, as they did on the coffer in the king's chamber, does nothing to confirm the speculation that this object was the result of hand work. When I read Petree's passage concerning these deviations, a flood of memories came to me of my own history with saws, both power and manual driven. With these experiences, plus those observed in others, it seems inconceivable to me that manpower was the motivating force behind the saw which cut the granite coffers. While cutting steel with hand saws, an object that has a long work face, and certainly one with such dimensions as the coffers, would not be cut with great rapidity, and the direction the saw may turn can be seen well in advance of a serious mistake being made. The smaller the work piece, naturally, the faster the blade would cut through it. On the other hand, if the saw is mechanized and is cutting rapidly through the workpiece, the saw could wander from its intended course and cut through the guideline at a certain point at such a speed that the error is made before the condition can be corrected. This is not uncommon. This does not mean that a manually operated saw cannot wander. but that the speed of the operation would determine the efficiency in discovering any deviation that the saw may have from its intended course. Along with the evidence on the outside, further evidence of the use of high-speed machine tools can be found on the inside of the granite coffer in the king's chamber. The methods that were evidently used by the pyramid builders to hollow out the inside of the granite coffers are similar to the methods which would be used to machine out the inside of components today. Inside the king's chamber. Dunn says that tool marks on the inside of the granite coffer in the king's chamber indicate that when the granite was hollowed out, preliminary roughing cuts were made by drilling holes into the granite around the area which was to be removed. According to Petrie, these drill holes were made with tube drills, which left a central core that had to be knocked away after the hole had been cut. After all the holes had been drilled, and all the cores removed, Petrie surmises that the coffer was then hand-worked to its desired dimension. The machinists on this particular piece of granite once again let their tools get the better of them, and the resulting errors are still to be found on the inside of the coffer in the king's chamber. On the E inside is a portion of a tube drill hole remaining, where they had tilted the drill over into the side by not working it vertically. They tried hard to polish away all that part and took off about 1/10 of an inch thickness all round it, but still they had to leave the side of the hole 1/10 deep, 3 long, and 1.3 wide. The bottom of it is 8 or 9 below the original top of the coffer. They made a similar error on the N inside, but of a much less extent. There are traces of horizontal grinding lines along the W inside. Says Dunn, the errors noted by Petrie are not uncommon in modern machine shops, and I must confess to having made them myself on occasion. Several factors could be involved in creating this condition, although I cannot visualize any one of them being a hand operation. Once again, while working their drill into the granite, the machinists had made a mistake before they had time to correct it. Let us speculate for a moment that the drill was being worked by hand. How far into the granite would they be able to cut before the drill had to be removed to permit cleaning the waste out of the hole? Would they be able to drill 8 or 9 inches into the granite without having to remove their drill? It is inconceivable to me that such a depth could be achieved with a hand-operated drill without the frequent withdrawal of the drill to clean out the hole, or provisions being made for the removal of the waste while the drill was still cutting. It is possible, therefore, that frequent withdrawals of the drill would expose their error, and that they would have noticed the direction their drill was taking before it had cut a 0.2-inch gouge into the side of the coffer, and before it had reached a depth of 8 or 9 inches. Can't we see the same situation with the drill as with the saw? Here we have 2 high-speed operations where errors are made before the operators have time to correct them. Although the ancient Egyptians are not given credit for having a simple wheel, the evidence proves that they not only had the wheel, they had a more sophisticated use for it. The evidence of lathe work is markedly distinct on some of the artifacts housed in the Cairo Museum, as well as those that were studied by Petrie. 2 pieces of diorite in Petrie's collection he identified as being the result of true turning on a lathe. Dunn notes that Petrie did not identify the means by which he inspected the core, whether he used metrology instruments, a microscope, or the naked eye. He also mentions that all Egyptologists do not universally accept Petrie's conclusions. For instance, in Ancient Egyptian Materials and Industries, author Lucas takes issue with Petrie's conclusion that the grooves were the result of fixed jewel points. He states, "In my opinion, to suppose the knowledge of cutting these gemstones to form teeth, and setting them in the metal in such a manner that they would bear the strain of hard use, and to do this at the early period assigned to them, would present greater difficulties than those explained by the assumption of their employment. But were there indeed teeth such as postulated by Petrie? The evidence to prove their presence is as follows. A cylindrical core of granite grooved round and round by a graving point, the grooves being continuous and forming a spiral, within one part a single groove that may be traced 5 rotations round the core. B. Part of a drill hole in diorite with 17 equidistant grooves, due to the successive rotation of the same cutting point. C. Another piece of diorite, with a series of grooves plowed out to a depth of over 1/100th of an inch at a single cut. D. Other pieces of diorite showing the regular equidistant grooves of a saw. E. 2 pieces of diorite bowls with hieroglyphs incised with a very free cutting point, and neither scraped nor ground out. But if an abrasive powder had been used, with soft copper saws and drills, it is highly probable that pieces of the abrasive would have been forced into the metal, where they might have remained for some time, and any such accidental and temporary teeth would have produced the same effect as intentional and permanent ones. Lucas goes on to speculate that withdrawing the tube drill in order to remove waste and insert fresh grit into the hole created the grooves. There are problems with this theory. Dunn says that it is doubtful that a simple tool that is being turned by hand will remain turning while the artisans draw it out of the hole. Likewise, placing the tool back into a clean hole with fresh grit would not require that the tool rotate until it was at the work face. There is also the question of the taper on both the hole and the core. Both would effectively provide clearance between the tool and the granite, thereby making sufficient contact to create the grooves impossible under these conditions. Says Dunn, "The method I propose explains how the holes and cores found at Giza could have been cut. It is capable of creating all the details that Petrie and myself puzzled over. Unfortunately for Petrie, the method was unknown at the time he made his studies, so it is not surprising that he could not find any satisfactory answers. The application of ultrasonic machining is the only method that completely satisfies logic, from a technical viewpoint, and explains all noted phenomena. Ultrasonic machining is the oscillatory motion of a tool that chips away material, like a jackhammer chipping away at a piece of concrete pavement, except much faster and not as measurable in its reciprocation. The ultrasonic tool bit, vibrating at 19,000 to 25,000 cycles per second, Hertz, has found unique application in the precision machining of odd-shaped holes in hard, brittle materials such as hardened steels, carbides, ceramics, and semiconductors. An abrasive slurry or paste is used to accelerate the cutting action. Ultrasonic machining the granite core. Says Dunn, "The most significant detail of the drilled holes and cores studied by Petrie is that the groove is cut deeper through the quartz than the feldspar. Quartz crystals are employed in the production of ultrasonic sound, and conversely are responsive to the influence of vibration in the ultrasonic ranges, and can be induced to vibrate at high frequency. In machining granite, using ultrasonics, the harder material, quartz, would not necessarily offer more resistance, as it would during conventional machining practices. An ultrasonically vibrating tool bit would find numerous sympathetic partners while cutting through granite, embedded right in the granite itself. Instead of resisting the cutting action, the quartz would be induced to respond and vibrate in sympathy with the high-frequency waves and amplify the abrasive action as the tool cut through it. The fact that there is a groove may be explained several ways. An uneven flow of energy may have caused the tool to oscillate more on one side than the other. The tool may have been improperly mounted. A build-up of abrasive on one side of the tool may have cut the groove as the tool spiraled into the granite. The tapering sides of the hole and the core are perfectly normal when we consider the basic requirements for all types of cutting tools. This requirement is that clearance be provided between the tool's non-machining surfaces and the workpiece. Instead of having a straight tube, therefore, we would have a tube with a wall thickness that gradually became thinner along its length, the outside diameter getting gradually smaller, creating clearance between the tool and the hole, and the inside diameter getting larger, creating clearance between the tool and the central core. This would allow a free flow of abrasive slurry to reach the cutting area. A tube drill of this design would also explain the tapering of the sides of the hole and the core. By using a tube drill made of softer material than the abrasive, the cutting edge would gradually wear away. The dimensions of the hole, therefore, would correspond to the dimensions of the tool at the cutting edge. As the tool became worn, the hole and the core would reflect this wear, in the form of a taper. Dunn claims that with ultrasonic machining, The tool can plunge straight down into the workpiece. It can also be screwed into the workpiece. The spiral groove can be explained if we consider one of the methods that is predominantly used to uniformly advance machine components. The rotational speed of the drill is not a factor in this cutting method. The rotation of the drill is merely a means to advance the drill into the workpiece. Using a screw and nut method, the tube drill could be efficiently advanced into the workpiece by turning in a clockwise direction. The screw would gradually thread through the nut, forcing the oscillating drill into the granite. It would be the ultrasonically induced motion of the drill that would do the cutting, and not the rotation. The latter will only be needed to sustain a cutting action at the workface. By definition, the process is not a drilling process by conventional standards, but a grinding process in which abrasives are caused to impact the material in such a way that a controlled amount of material is removed. Says Dunn. Another method by which the grooves could have been created is through the use of a spinning trepanning tool that has been mounted off-centered to its rotational axis. Clyde Treadwell of Sonic Mill Incorporated, Albuquerque, New Mexico, explained to me that when an off-centered drill rotated into the granite, it would gradually be forced into alignment with the rotational axis of the drilling machine's axis. The grooves, he claims, could be created as the drill was rapidly withdrawn from the hole. If Treadwell's theory is the correct one, it still requires a level of technology that is far more developed and sophisticated than what the ancient pyramid builders are given credit for. This method may be a valid alternative to the theory of ultrasonic machining, even though ultrasonics resolves all the unanswered questions where other theories have fallen short. Methods may have been proposed that might cover a singular aspect of the machine marks and not progress to the method described here. It is when we search for a single method that provides an answer for old data that we move away from primitive, and even conventional, machining, and are forced to consider methods that are somewhat anomalous for that period in history. Granite boxes in rock tunnels. In February 1995, Dunn joined Graham Hancock and Robert Bauval in Cairo to participate in a documentary. While there, he came across and measured some artifacts produced by the ancient pyramid builders, which prove beyond a shadow of a doubt that highly advanced and sophisticated tools and methods were employed by this ancient civilization. The group were examining artifacts found in the rock tunnels at the temple of Serapeum at Saqqara, the site of the step pyramid and Zoser's tomb. Says Dunn, "We were in the stifling atmosphere of the tunnels where the dust kicked up by tourists lay heavily in the still air. These tunnels contain 21 huge granite boxes. Each box weighs an estimated 65 tons, and together with the huge lid that sits on top of them, the total weight of the assembly is around 100 tons. Just inside the entrance of the tunnels there is a lid that had not been finished, and beyond this lid, barely fitting within the confines of one of the tunnels, is a granite box that had also been rough-hewn. The granite boxes are approximately 13 feet long, 7½ feet wide, and 11 feet high. They are installed in crypts that were cut out of the limestone bedrock at staggered intervals along the tunnels. The floors of the crypts were about 4 feet below the tunnel floor, and the boxes were set into a recess in the center. Bauval was addressing the engineering aspects of installing such huge boxes within a confined space where the last crypt was located near the end of the tunnel. With no room for the hundreds of slaves pulling on ropes to position these boxes, how were they moved into place? While Hancock and Bauval were filming, I jumped down into a crypt and placed my parallel against the outside surface of the box. It was perfectly flat. I shone the flashlight and found no deviation from a perfectly flat surface. I clambered through a broken-out edge into the inside of another giant box, and again I was astonished to find it astoundingly flat. I looked for errors and couldn't find any. I wished at that time that I had the proper equipment to scan the entire surface and ascertain the full scope of the work. Nonetheless, I was perfectly happy to use my flashlight and straightedge and stand in awe of this incredibly precise and incredibly huge artifact. Checking the lid and the surface on which it sat, I found them both to be perfectly flat. It occurred to me that this gave the manufacturers of this piece a perfect seal. Two perfectly flat surfaces pressed together with the weight of one pushing out the air between the two surfaces. The technical difficulties in finishing the inside of this piece made the sarcophagus in Khafra's pyramid seem simple in comparison. Canadian researcher Robert McKenty accompanied me at this time. He saw the significance of the discovery and was filming with his camera. At that moment, I knew how Howard Carter must have felt when he discovered Tutankhamun's tomb. The dust-filled atmosphere in the tunnels made breathing uncomfortable. I could only imagine what it would be like if I was finishing off a piece of granite, regardless of the method used, how unhealthy it would be. Surely it would have been better to finish the work in the open air. I was so astonished by this find that it didn't occur to me until later that the builders of these relics, for some esoteric reason, intended for them to be ultra-precise. They had taken the trouble to bring into the tunnel the unfinished product and finish it underground for a good reason. It is the logical thing to do if you require a high degree of precision in the piece that you are working. To finish it with such precision at a site that maintained a different atmosphere and a different temperature, such as in the open under the hot sun, would mean that when it was finally installed in the cool cave-like temperatures of the tunnel, you would lose that precision. The granite would change its shape through thermal expansion and contraction. The solution then, as it is now, of course, is to prepare precision surfaces in the location in which they were going to be housed. This discovery, and the realization of its critical importance to the artisans that built it, went beyond my wildest dreams of discoveries to be made in Egypt. For a man of my inclination, this was better than King Tut's tomb. The Egyptians' intentions with respect to precision are perfectly clear. But to what end? Further studies of these artifacts should include thorough mapping and inspection with the following tools: a laser interferometer with surface flatness checking capabilities, an ultrasonic thickness gauge to check the thickness of the walls to determine their consistency to uniform thickness, an optical flat with monochromatic light source. Are the surfaces really finished to optical precision? Dunn contacted 4 precision granite manufacturers in the U.S. and hasn't been able to find one who can do this kind of work. He received a letter from Eric Leiter of True Stone Corporation about the technical feasibility of creating several Egyptian artifacts, including the giant granite boxes found in the bedrock tunnels in the Temple of Serapeum at Saqqara. The letter read as follows: Dear Christopher, first, I would like to thank you for providing me with all the fascinating information. Most people never get the opportunity to take part in something like this. You mentioned to me that the box was derived from one solid block of granite. A piece of granite of that size is estimated to weigh 200,000 pounds, if it was Sierra White granite, which weighs approximately 175 pounds per cubic foot. If a piece of that size was available, the cost would be enormous. Just the raw piece of rock would cost somewhere in the area of $115,000. This price does not include cutting the block to size or any freight charges. The next obvious problem would be the transportation. There would be many special permits issued by the DOT and would cost thousands of dollars. From the information that I gathered from your facts, the Egyptians moved this piece of granite nearly 500 miles. That is an incredible achievement for a society that existed hundreds of years ago. Says Dunn. Eric went on to say that his company did not have the equipment or capabilities to produce the boxes in this manner. He said that his company would create the boxes in 5 pieces, ship them to the customer, and bolt them together on site. Another artifact I inspected was a piece of granite that I quite literally stumbled across while strolling around the Giza Plateau later that day. I concluded, after doing a preliminary check of this piece, that the ancient pyramid builders had to have used a machine with 3 axes of movement, X, Y, Z, to guide the tool in 3-dimensional space to create it. Outside of being incredibly precise, normal flat surfaces, being simple geometry, can justifiably be explained away by simple methods. This piece, though, drives us beyond the question what tools were used to cut it, to a more far-reaching question, What guided the cutting tool? In addressing this question and being comfortable with the answer, it is helpful to have a working knowledge of contour machining. Many of the artifacts that modern civilization creates would be impossible to produce using simple handwork. We are surrounded by artifacts that are the result of men and women employing their minds to create tools which overcome physical limitations. We have developed machine tools to create the dies that produce the aesthetic contours on the cars that we drive, the radios we listen to, and the appliances we use. To create the dies to produce these items, a cutting tool has to accurately follow a predetermined contoured path in 3 dimensions. In some applications, it will move in 3 dimensions, simultaneously using 3 or more axes of movement. The artifact that I was looking at required a minimum of 3 axes of motion to machine it. When the machine tool industry was relatively young, techniques were employed where the final shape was finished by hand, using templates as a guide. Today, with the use of precision computer numerical control machines, there is little call for handwork. A little polishing to remove unwanted tool marks may be the only handwork required. To know that an artifact has been produced on such a machine, therefore, one would expect to see a precise surface with indications of tool marks that show the path of the tool. This is what I found on the Giza Plateau, laying out in the open south of the Great Pyramid, about 100 yards east of the Second Pyramid. There are so many rocks of all shapes and sizes lying around this area that to the untrained eye this one could easily be overlooked. To a trained eye it may attract some cursory attention and a brief muse. I was fortunate that it both caught my attention and that I had some tools with which to inspect it. There were 2 pieces laying close together, one larger than the other. They had originally been one piece and had been broken. I found I needed every tool that I had brought with me to inspect it. I was most interested in the accuracy of the contour and its symmetry. What we have is an object that, 3-dimensionally as one piece, could be compared in shape to a small sofa. The seat is a contour that blends into the walls of the arms and the back. I checked the contour using the profile gauge along 3 axes of its length, starting at the blend radius near the back and ending near the tangency point, which blended smoothly where the contour radius meets the front. The wire radius gauge is not the best way to determine the accuracy of this piece. When adjusting the wires at one position on the block and moving to another position, the gauge could be reseated on the contour, but questions could be raised as to whether the hand that positioned it compensated for some inaccuracy in the contour. However, placing the parallel at several points along and around the axes of the contour, I found the surface to be extremely precise. At one point, near a crack in the piece, there was light showing through, but the rest of the piece allowed very little to show. During this time, I had attracted quite a crowd. It's difficult to traverse the Giza Plateau at the best of times without getting attention from the camel drivers, donkey riders, and purveyors of trinkets. It wasn't long after I had pulled the tools out of my backpack that I had 2 willing helpers, Mohammed and Mustafa, who weren't at all interested in compensation. At least that's what they told me. But I can honestly say that I lost my shirt on that adventure. I had cleaned sand and dirt out of the corner of the larger block and washed it out with water. I used a white T-shirt that I was carrying in my backpack to wipe the corner out so I could get an impression of it with forming wax. Mustafa talked me into giving him the shirt before I left. I was so inspired by what I had found I tossed it to him. Mohammed held the wire gauge at different points along the contour while I took photographs of it. I then took the forming wax and heated it with a match, kindly provided by the Mövenpick Hotel, then pressed it into the corner blend radius. I shaved off the splayed part and positioned it at different points around. Mohammed held the wax still while I took photographs. By this time there was an old camel driver and a policeman on a horse looking on. What I discovered with the wax was a uniform radius, tangential with the contour, the back, and the side wall. When I returned to the U.S., I measured the wax using a radius gauge, and found that it was a true radius measuring 7/16 of an inch. The sidearm blend radius has a design feature that is a common engineering practice today. By cutting a relief at the corner, a mating part that is to match or butt up against the surface with the large blend radius may have a smaller radius. This feature provides for a more efficient machining operation because it allows a cutting tool with a large diameter and therefore a large radius to be used. With greater rigidity in the tool, more material can be removed when making a cut. I believe there is more, much more, that can be gleaned using these methods of study. I believe the Cairo Museum contains many artifacts that, when properly analyzed, will lead to the same conclusion that I have drawn from this piece. High-speed motorized machinery must have been used. Says Dunn in conclusion, the use of high-speed motorized machinery and what we might call modern techniques in non-conventional machining, in manufacturing the granite artifacts found at Giza and other locations in Egypt, warrants serious study by qualified, open-minded people who could approach the subject without preconceived notions. In terms of a more thorough understanding of the level of technology employed by the ancient pyramid builders, the implications of these discoveries are tremendous. We are not only presented with hard evidence that seems to have eluded us for decades, and which provide further evidence proving the ancients to be advanced, we are also provided with an opportunity to reanalyze everything from a different perspective. Understanding how something is made opens up a different dimension when trying to determine why it was made. The precision in these artifacts is irrefutable. Even if we ignore the question of how they were produced, we are still faced with the question of why such precision was needed. Revelation of new data invariably raises new questions. In this case, it's understandable to hear, where are the machines? Machines are tools. The question should be applied universally and can be asked of anyone who believes other methods may have been used. The truth is that no tools have been found to explain any theory on how the pyramids were built or granite boxes were cut. More than 80 pyramids have been discovered in Egypt, and the tools that built them have never been found. Even if we accepted the notion that copper tools are capable of producing these incredible artifacts, the few copper implements that have been uncovered do not represent the number of such tools that would have been used if every stonemason who worked on the pyramids at just the Giza site owned one or two. In the Great Pyramid alone, there are an estimated 2,300,000 blocks of stone, both limestone and granite, weighing between 2 tons and 70 tons each. That is a mountain of evidence, and there are no tools surviving to explain its creation. The principle of Occam's razor, where the simplest means of manufacturing holds force until proven inadequate, has guided my attempt to understand the pyramid builders' methods. With Egyptologists, there is one component of this principle that has been lacking. The simplest methods do not satisfy the evidence, and they have been reluctant to consider other less simple methods. There is little doubt that the capabilities of the ancient pyramid builders have been seriously underestimated. The most distinct evidence that I can relate is the precision and mastery of machining technologies that have only been recognized in recent years. Some technologies the Egyptians possessed still astound modern artisans and engineers, primarily for this reason. The development of machine tools has been intrinsically linked with the availability of consumer goods and the desire to find a customer. One reference point for judging a civilization to be advanced has been our current state of manufacturing evolution. Manufacturing is the manifestation of all scientific and engineering effort. For over 100 years, industry has progressed exponentially. Since Petrie first made his critical observations between 1880 and 1882, our civilization has leapt forward at breakneck speed to provide the consumer with goods, all created by artisans, and still, over 100 years after Petrie, these artisans are utterly astounded by the achievements of the ancient pyramid builders. They are astounded not so much by what they perceive a society is capable of using primitive tools, but by comparing these prehistoric artifacts with their own current level of expertise and technological advancement. The interpretation and understanding of a civilization's level of technology should not hinge on the preservation of a written record of every technique that they had developed. The nuts and bolts of our society do not always make good copy, and a stone mural will more than likely be cut to convey an ideological message rather than the technique used to inscribe it. Records of the technology developed by our modern civilization rest in media that is vulnerable and could conceivably cease to exist in the event of a worldwide catastrophe, such as a nuclear war or another ice age. Consequently, after several thousand years, an interpretation of an artisan's methods may be more accurate than an interpretation of his language. The language of science and technology doesn't have the same freedom of speech. So even though the tools and machines have not survived the thousands of years since their use, we have to assume, by objective analysis of the evidence, that they did exist. There is much to be learnt from our distant ancestors, if only we can open our minds and accept that another civilization from a distant epoch may have developed manufacturing techniques that are as great, or perhaps even greater than, our own. As we assimilate new data and new views of old data, it is wise to heed the advice Petrie gave to an American who visited him during his research at Giza. The American expressed a feeling that he had been to a funeral after hearing Petrie's findings, which had evidently shattered some favorite pyramid theory of the time. Petrie said, "By all means let the old theories have a decent burial, though we should take care that in our haste none of the wounded ones are buried alive." With such a convincing collection of artifacts that prove the existence of precision machinery in ancient Egypt, the idea that the Great Pyramid was built by an advanced civilization that inhabited the earth thousands of years ago becomes more admissible. I'm not proposing that this civilization was more advanced technologically than ours on all levels, but it does appear that, as far as masonry work and construction are concerned, they were exceeding current capabilities and specifications. Making routine work of precision machining huge pieces of extremely hard igneous rock is astonishingly impressive. Considered logically, the pyramid builders' civilization must have developed their knowledge in the same manner any civilization would, and had reached their state-of-the-art through technological progress over many years. As of this writing, there is much research being conducted by many professionals throughout the world. These people are determined to find answers to the many unsolved mysteries, indicating that our planet Earth has supported other advanced societies in the distant past. Perhaps when this new knowledge and insight is assimilated, the history books will be rewritten and, if mankind is able to learn from historical events, then perhaps the greatest lesson we can learn is now being formulated for the benefit of future generations. New technology and advances in the sciences are enabling us to take a closer look at the foundations upon which world history has been built, and these foundations seem to be crumbling. It would be illogical, therefore, to dogmatically adhere to any theoretical point concerning ancient civilizations. The Great Pyramid and the Mighty Crystal. How then can we design an object to respond sympathetically with the Earth's vibration? How do we utilize that energy? How can we turn it into usable electricity? If we could somehow utilize this energy, it would possibly be the greatest invention in the world. Says Dunn, we must first of all understand what a transducer is. Early on, we discussed the piezoelectric effect vibration has on quartz crystal. Alternately compressing and releasing the quartz produces electricity. Microphones and other modern electronic devices work on this principle. Speak into a microphone and the sound of your voice, mechanical vibration, is converted into electrical impulses. The reverse happens with a speaker, where electrical impulses are converted into mechanical vibrations. It has also been speculated that quartz-bearing rock creates the phenomenon known as ball lightning. The quartz crystal is the transducer. It transforms one form of energy into another. Understanding the source of the energy and having the means to tap into it, all we need to do is convert the unlimited mechanical stresses therein into usable electricity utilizing quartz crystals. The Great Pyramid was a geomechanical power plant that responded sympathetically with the Earth's vibrations and converted that energy into electricity. They used the electricity to power their civilization, which included machine tools with which they shaped hard, igneous rock. Okay, you may say, how does this power plant work? It's all very well to throw out a broad statement like that, which rationalizes your own theory on machining. But we need more facts and proof that what has been stated is more than an interesting and radical theory. It has to have more proof, based on truth and fact. Well, let's start with the power crystal, or transducers. It so happens that the transducers for this power plant are an integral part of the construction that is designed to resonate in harmony with the pyramid itself, and also the Earth. The King's Chamber, in which a procession of visitors have noted unusual effects, and in which Tom Danley detected the infrasonic vibrations of the Earth, is in itself a mighty transducer. In any machine, there are devices that function to make the machine work. This machine was no different. Though the inner chambers and passages of the Great Pyramid seem to be devoid of what we would consider to be mechanical or electrical devices, there are devices still housed there that are similar in nature to mechanical devices created today. These devices could also be considered to be electrical devices, in that they have the ability to convert or transduce mechanical energy into electrical energy. You might think of other examples, as the evidence becomes more apparent. The devices which have resided inside the Great Pyramid since it was built have not been recognized for what they truly were. Nevertheless, they were an integral part of this machine's function. The granite out of which this chamber is constructed is an igneous rock containing silicon quartz crystals. This particular granite, which was brought from the Aswan quarries, contains 55% or more quartz crystal. Work by two scientists, D.J. Nelson and David H. Coville, shows a special significance in the stone the builders chose in building the King's Chamber. They write, "This means that lining the King's Chamber, for instance, are literally hundreds of tons of microscopic quartz particles. The particles are hexagonal, bipyramidal, or rhombohedral in shape. Rhomboid crystals are six-sided prisms with quadrangle sides that present a parallelogram on any of the six facets. This guarantees that embedded within the granite rock is a high percentage of quartz fragments whose surfaces, by the law of natural averages, are parallel on the upper and lower sides. Additionally, any slight plasticity of the granite aggregate would allow a piezo tension upon these parallel surfaces and cause an electromotive flow. The great mass of stone above the pyramid chambers presses downward by gravitational force upon the granite walls, thereby converting them into perpetual electric generators. The inner chambers of the Great Pyramid have been generating electrical energy since their construction, 46 centuries ago. A man within the King's Chamber would thus come within a weak but definite induction field." Dunn comments that, "While Nelson and Coville have made an interesting observation and speculation regarding the granite inside the pyramid, I am not sure that they are correct in stating that the pressure of thousands of tons of masonry would create an electromotive flow in the granite. The pressure on the quartz would need to be alternatively pressed and released in order for electricity to flow. The pressure they are describing would be static, and while it would undoubtedly squeeze the quartz to some degree, the electron flow would cease after the pressure came to rest. Quartz crystal does not create energy. It just converts one kind of energy into another. Needless to say, this point in itself leads to some interesting observations regarding the characteristics of the granite complex." The acoustics of the Great Pyramid. One key to Dunn's theory of the Giza power plant is the acoustics of the Great Pyramid. Above the King's Chamber are 5 rows of granite beams, making a total of 43 beams weighing up to 70 tons each. Each layer is separated by a space large enough to crawl into. The red granite beams are cut square and parallel on 3 sides, but were left seemingly untouched on the top surface, which was rough and uneven. Some of them even had holes gouged into the top of them. In cutting these giant monoliths, the builders evidently found it necessary to treat the beams destined for the uppermost chamber with the same respect as those intended for the ceiling directly above the king's chamber. Each beam was cut flat and square on 3 sides, with the top side seemingly untouched. This is interesting, considering that the ones directly above the king's chamber would be the only ones visible to those entering the pyramid. Even so, the attention these granite ceiling beams received was none the less inferior to the attention commanded by the granite out of which the walls were constructed. William Flinders Petrie writes, "The roofing beams are not of polished granite as they have been described. On the contrary, they have rough-dressed surfaces, very fair and true so far as they go, but without any pretense to polish." From his observations of the granite inside the king's chamber, Petrie continues with those of upper chambers. "All the chambers over the king's chamber are floored with horizontal beams of granite, rough-dressed on the undersides which form the ceilings, but wholly unwrought above." Says Dunn, "It is remarkable that the builders would exert the same amount of effort in finishing the 34 beams, which would not be seen once the pyramid was built, as they did 9 beams forming the ceiling of the king's chamber, which would be seen. Even if these beams were imperative to the strength of the complex, deviations in accuracy would surely be allowed, making the cutting of the blocks less time-consuming, unless, of course, they were either using these upper beams for a specific purpose, or were using standardized machinery methods that produced parts with little variation. Traditional theory has it that the granite beams served to relieve pressure on the chamber and allow this chamber to be built with a flat ceiling. I disagree. The pyramid builders knew about and were already utilizing a design feature that was structurally sound on a lower level inside the pyramid. If we look at the cantilevered arched ceiling of the queen's chamber, we can see that it has more masonry piled on top of it than the king's chamber. The question could be asked, therefore, that if the builders had wanted to put a flat ceiling in this chamber, wouldn't they have only needed to add 1 layer of beams? For the distance between the walls, a single layer of beams in the queen's chamber, like the 43 granite beams above the king's chamber, would be supporting no more than their own weight. This leads me to ask, why 5 layers of these beams? To include so many monolithic blocks of granite in the structure is redundant, especially when we consider the amount of incredibly difficult work that must have been invested in quarrying, cutting, transporting them 500 miles from the Aswan quarries, and then raising them to the 175-foot level of the pyramid. There is surely another reason for such an enormous effort and investment of time. Continues Dunn, "The 43 giant beams above the king's chamber were not included in the structure to relieve the king's chamber from excessive pressure from above, but were included to fulfill a more advanced purpose. A simple yet refined technology can be discerned in the granite complex at the heart of the Great Pyramid, and with this technology the ancient power plant operated. The giant granite beams above the king's chamber could be considered to be 43 individual bridges. Like the Tacoma Narrows Bridge, each one is capable of vibrating if a suitable type and amount of energy is introduced. If we were to concentrate on forcing just one of the beams to oscillate, with each of the other beams tuned to that frequency, the other beams would be forced to vibrate at the same frequency, or a harmonic. If the energy contained within the forcing frequency was great enough, this transfer of energy from one beam to the next could affect the entire series of beams. A situation could exist, therefore, in which one individual beam in the ceiling directly above the king's chamber could indirectly influence another beam in the uppermost chamber by forcing it to vibrate at the same frequency as the original forcing frequency, or one of its harmonic frequencies. The amount of energy absorbed by these beams from the source would depend on the natural resonant frequency of the beam. The ability of the beams to dissipate the energy they are subject to would have to be considered, as well as the natural resonating frequency of the granite beam. If the forcing frequency, sound input, coincided with the natural frequency of the beam, and there was little damping, the beams were not restrained from vibrating, then the transfer of energy would be maximized. Consequently, so would the vibration of the beams. It is quite clear that the giant granite beams above the king's chamber have a length of 17 feet, the width of the chamber, in which they can react to induced motion and vibrate without restraint. Some damping may occur if the beams' adjacent faces are so close that they rub together. However, if the beams vibrate in unison, it is possible that such damping would not happen. To perfect the ability of the 43 granite beams to resonate with the forcing frequency, the natural frequency of each beam would have to be of the same frequency as the forcing frequency, or be in harmony with it. Tuned granite beams. Dunn asserts, "It would be possible to tune a length of granite such as those found in the Great Pyramid by altering its physical dimensions, as precise frequency could be attained by either altering the length of the beam which is allowed to vibrate, as in the playing of stringed instruments, or by removing material from the beam's mass, as in the tuning of bells. A bell is tuned to a fundamental hum, and its harmonics by removing metal from critical areas. Striking it while it was being held in a position similar to that of the beams above the king's chamber, as one would strike a tuning fork, could induce oscillation of the beam. The frequency of the vibration would be sampled, and more material removed until the correct frequency had been reached. Rather than a lack of attention, therefore, the top surfaces of these granite beams may have arrived at their present shape through the application of more careful attention and work than the sides or the bottom. Before being placed inside the Great Pyramid, each beam may have been suspended on each end, in the same position that it would hold once placed inside the Great Pyramid, and a considerable amount of attention paid to the upper surface. Each granite beam was shaped and gouged on the top side as it was tuned. Thousands of tons of granite were actually tuned to resonate in harmony with the fundamental frequency of the earth and the pyramid. The granite beams above the king's chamber resemble what a granite beam might look like after it has been tuned in such a manner. After cutting 3 sides square and true to each other, the remaining side could have been cut and shaped until it reached a specific resonating frequency. The removal of material on the upper side of the beam would take into consideration the elasticity of the beam, as a variation of elasticity in the beam might result in more material being removed at one point along the beam's length than another. The fact that the beams above the king's chamber are all shapes and sizes would support this speculation. In some of the granite beams it wouldn't be surprising to find holes gouged out of the granite as the tuners worked on trouble spots. Piazzi Smythe also comments on these markings in his classic book, The Great Pyramid. These markings, however, have only been discovered in those dark holes or hollows, the so-called chambers, but much rather hollows of construction broken into by Colonel Howard Vyse above the king's chamber of the Great Pyramid. There also you see other traces of the steps of mere practical work, such as the bat holes in the stones, by which the heavy blocks were doubtless lifted to their places, and everything is left perfectly rough. Rather than holes used for lifting the blocks into place, William Flinders Petrie speculates on another reason for Smythe's so-called bat holes. The flooring of the top chamber has large holes in it, evidently to hold the butt ends of beams which supported the sloping roof blocks during the building. Dunn comments, "Another reason for the holes gouged in the beams near the end of the beams may have been to provide feedback into the center of the beam, instead of transferring vibration into the core masonry. Although we must consider that both reasons given for the bat holes may be possible explanations for their existence, it does not preclude other possibilities which have yet to be considered." According to Boris Said, who was with Tom Danley when he conducted his tests, the king's chamber resonated at a fundamental frequency, and the entire structure of the king's chamber reinforced this frequency by producing dominant frequencies that created an F-sharp chord. Using large amplifiers, F-sharp is the frequency that is in harmony with the earth. Said claimed that the Indian shamans tuned their ceremonial flutes to F-sharp because it is a frequency that is sacred to Mother Earth. Testing for frequency, Tom Danley placed accelerometers in the spaces above the king's chamber, but I don't know whether he went as far as checking the frequency of each beam. Said said something in his interview with Art Bell that may be some indication of where Danley was heading with his research. He said that the beams above the king's chamber were like baffles in a speaker. Further research would need to be conducted before any assertion could be made as to the relationship these holes may have with tuning these beams to a specific frequency. However, when we consider the characteristics of the entire granite complex, along with other features found in the Great Pyramid, it seems clear that the results of this research will be along the lines of what I am theorizing. Without confirmation that the granite beams were carefully tuned to respond to a precise frequency, I will infer that such a condition exists in light of what is found in the area. While I have not found any specific record of anyone striking the beams above the king's chamber and measuring their resonant frequencies, there has been quite a lot written about the resonating qualities of the coffer inside the chamber itself. The coffer is said to resonate at 438 Hz, and is at resonance with the resonant frequency of the chamber. This is easily tested, and has been noted by numerous visitors to the Great Pyramid, including myself. Another interesting discovery was made by the Shore expedition. This is a preliminary report told to Art Bell by Boris Said, but it was noted that the floor of the king's chamber does not sit on solid rock. Not only is the entire granite complex surrounded by massive limestone walls with a space between the granite and the limestone, the floor itself sits on what is characterized as corrugated-shaped rock. It's no wonder the entire chamber rings while walking around inside. Says Dunn concerning this, "Note also that the walls of the chamber do not sit on the granite floor, but are supported outside and 5 inches below the floor level. The granite complex inside the Great Pyramid, therefore, is poised ready to convert vibrations from the earth into electricity. What is lacking is a sufficient amount of energy to drive the beams and activate the piezoelectric properties within. The ancients, though, had anticipated the need for more energy than what would be collected only within the king's chamber. They had determined that they needed to tap into the vibrations of the earth over a larger area inside the pyramid, and deliver that energy to the power center, the king's chamber, thereby substantially increasing the amplitude of the oscillations of the granite. While modern research into architectural acoustics might predominantly focus upon minimizing the reverberation effects of sound in enclosed spaces, there is reason to believe that the ancient pyramid builders were attempting to achieve the opposite. The Grand Gallery, which is considered to be an architectural masterpiece, is an enclosed space in which resonators were installed in the slots along the ledge that runs the length of the gallery. As the Earth's vibration flowed through the Great Pyramid, the resonators converted the energy to airborne sound. By design, the angles and surfaces of the walls and ceiling of the Grand Gallery caused reflection of the sound and its focus into the king's chamber. Although the king's chamber was also responding to the energy flowing through the pyramid, much of the energy would flow past it. The design and utility of the Grand Gallery was to transfer the energy flowing through a large area of the pyramid into the resonant king's chamber. This sound was then focused into the granite resonating cavity at sufficient amplitude to drive the granite ceiling beams to oscillation. These beams, in turn, compelled the beams above them to resonate in harmonic sympathy. Thus, the input of sound and the maximization of resonance, the entire granite complex, in effect, became a vibrating mass of energy. The acoustic qualities of the design of the upper chambers of the Great Pyramid have been referenced and confirmed by numerous visitors since the time of Napoleon, whose men discharged their pistols at the top of the Grand Gallery, and noted that the explosion reverberated into the distance like rolling thunder. Striking the coffer inside the king's chamber results in a deep, bell-like sound of incredible and eerie beauty. and it has been a practice over the years for the Arab guides to demonstrate this resonating sound to the tourists they guide through the pyramid. This sound was included on Paul Horn's album, Inside the Great Pyramid. After being advised of the significant pitch produced by the coffer when it has been struck, and the response of the chamber to this pitch, Horn brought along a device which would give him the exact pitch and frequency. Horn tuned his flute to this tone which was emitted, which turned out to be A 438 cycles per second. In a fascinating booklet about his experiences at the Great Pyramid, Horn describes phenomena concerning the acoustic qualities of the inner chambers. The moment had arrived. It was time to play my flute. I thought of Ben Peich from Santa Rosa, California, a man who had told Mr. Horn about the pitch of the coffer and his suggestions to strike the coffer. I leaned over and hit the inside with the fleshy part of the side of my fist. A beautiful round tone was immediately produced. What a resonance! I remember him also saying, when you hear that tone, you will be poised in history that is ever present. I took the electronic tuning device I had brought along in one hand, and struck the coffer again with the other, and there it was, A 438, just as Ben had predicted. I tuned up to this pitch, and was ready to begin. The album opens with these events, so that you can hear all of these things for yourselves. After noting the eerie qualities of the king's and queen's chambers, Paul Horn went out onto the great step at the top of the Grand Gallery to continue his sound test. The Grand Gallery, he reported, sounded rather flat compared with the other chambers. He heard something remarkable at this time. He heard the music he was playing coming back to him clearly and distinctly from the king's chamber. The sound was going out into the Grand Gallery and was being reflected through the passageway and reverberating inside the king's chamber. Dunn says that it appears that the coffer inside the king's chamber was specifically tuned to a precise frequency, and that the room itself was scientifically engineered to be a resonator of that frequency. Perhaps these observations will finally provide an answer to a mystery that William Flinders Petrie had puzzled over at great length. His discovery of a flint pebble under the coffer after he raised it did not strike him as being unimportant for reasons he describes in the Pyramids and Temples of Giza. The flint pebble that had been put under the coffer is important. If any person wished at present to prop the coffer up, there are multitudes of stone chips in the pyramid ready to hand. Therefore, fetching a pebble from the outside seems to show that the coffer was first lifted at a time when no breakages had been made in the pyramid, and there were no chips lying about. This suggests that there was some means of access to the upper chambers, which are always available by removing loose blocks without any forcing. If the stones at the top of the shaft leading from the subterranean part to the gallery had been cemented in place, they must have been smashed to break through them. Or if there were granite portcullises in the antechamber, they must also have been destroyed, and it is not likely that any person would take the trouble to fetch a large flint pebble into the innermost part of the pyramid, if there were stone chips lying in his path. Says Dunn, "Is it possible that the flint pebble was placed underneath the coffer at the time of the building, and that the pebble served a purpose for those who placed it there? The alternative answer, that there was free access to the upper chambers, cannot be supported by fact, and even if it was, we are still faced with the question of why someone found it necessary to prop up the coffer. However, if we had just manufactured an object like the coffer and had it tuned to vibrate at a precise frequency, we would know that to sit flat on the floor would dampen the vibrations somewhat. So, by raising one end of the coffer onto the pebble, it could vibrate at peak efficiency. Another unique feature, which needs to be confirmed by on-site inspection, is the ratchet-style roofline. The problem with coming up with an accurate calculation of the true angle of the overlapping stones is that there is conflicting data from the only two researchers that I have found paying these overlaps any close attention. However, preliminary calculations are interesting to say the least. The angle of the Grand Gallery is 26.3 degrees. Smythe measured the height of the Grand Gallery and found that it varied between 333.9 inches and 346.0 inches. The overlaps are estimated to have approximately a 12-inch tilt. Smythe counted 36 overlaps in the 1,844.5 inches length of the roof. The surface of the overlapping stones in the roofline is close to a 45-degree angle from a vertical plane, 135 degrees polar coordinates, given that the ends of the gallery are 90 degrees. With this tilt of the roof tiles, a sound wave traveling vertically to the roof would be reflected off the tiles at a 90-degree angle and travel in the direction of the king's chamber. This gives another report, which didn't receive much attention, more pertinence. It has been reported that Al-Mamun's men had to break a false floor out of the gallery, and as they broke one stone out, another slid down in its place. It's a sketchy bit of information that would require further research. Al-Mamun's men were tearing out so much limestone that little attention was given to this. However, it should be kept in mind that there may have been a ratchet-style tiled floor in this gallery that matched the roof. Much of the stone that Al-Mamun cut out of the ascending passage was dropped down the descending passage. Later explorers, such as Caviglia, Davison, and Petrie, eventually cleared this passage of all debris, and most of this debris was dumped on the traditional rubbish pit on the north and east side of the Great Pyramid. Petrie reports finding inside the Great Pyramid a prism-shaped stone that had a half-round groove running its length. He also found in the descending passage a block of granite that was 20.6 inches thick, with a section of tubular drilled hole cut through the thickness on one edge. Where this granite came from and for what purpose it was used in the Great Pyramid was a mystery to Petrie. With more significant findings to attract attention, though, it's not surprising these details weren't given much consideration. Dunn says that it is possible to confirm that the Grand Gallery indeed reflected the work of an acoustical engineer using only its dimensions. The disappearance of the gallery resonators is easily explained, even though this structure was only accessible through a tortuously constricted shaft. The original design of the resonators will always be open to question. However, there is one device that performs in a manner that is necessary to respond sympathetically with vibrations. There is no reason that similar devices cannot be created today. There are many individuals who possess the necessary skills to recreate this equipment. The Helmholtz resonator and the Grand Gallery resonators. According to Dunn, a Helmholtz resonator would respond to vibrations coming from within the Earth and actually maximize the transfer of energy. The Helmholtz resonator is made of a round hollow sphere with a round opening that is 1/10 to 1/5 the diameter of the sphere. The size of the sphere determines the frequency at which it will resonate. If the resonant frequency of the resonator is in harmony with a vibrating source, such as a tuning fork, it will draw energy from the fork and resonate at greater amplitude than the fork will without its presence. It forces the fork to greater energy output than what is normal. Unless the energy of the fork is replenished, the fork will lose its energy quicker than it normally would without the Helmholtz resonator. But as long as the source continues to vibrate, the resonator will continue to draw energy from it at a greater rate. Dunn says that the Helmholtz resonator is normally made out of metal, but can be made out of other materials. Holding these resonators in place inside the gallery are members that are keyed into the structure by first being installed into the slots and then held in the vertical position with shot pins that locate in the groove that runs the length of the gallery. Dunn now thinks that the material for these members could have been wood, as trees are probably the most efficient responders to natural earth sounds. There are trees that, by virtue of their internal structure, such as cavities, are known to emit sounds or hum. Modern concert halls are designed and built to interact with the instruments performing within. They are huge musical instruments in themselves. The Great Pyramid can be seen as a huge musical instrument with each element designed to enhance the performance of the other. To choose natural materials, especially in the function of resonating devices, would be a natural and logical decision to make. The qualities of wood cannot be synthesized. The strange basalt vases of the Cairo Museum may be the resonators that Dunn is looking for. One of the most remarkable feats of machining can be found inside the Cairo Museum. I have stood in awe before the stone jars and bowls that are finely machined and perfectly balanced. The schist bowl with 3 lobes folded toward the center hub is an incredible piece of work. With the application of ultrasonics and sophisticated machinery, I can understand how they could be made. But the purpose for doing so has long escaped me. It seems like a tremendous amount of work to go to just to create a domestic vessel. Perhaps these stone artifacts, of which there were over 1,000 found at Saqqara, were used in some way to convert vibration into airborne sound. Are these vessels the Helmholtz resonators we are looking for? The enigmatic antechamber has been the subject of much consternation and discussion. Ludwig Borchardt, director of the German Institute in Cairo, forwarded one proposal for its use, circa 1925. Borchardt's theory proposed that a series of stone slabs were slid into place after Khufu had been entombed. He theorized that the half-round grooves in the granite wainscoting supported wooden beams that served as windlasses to lower the blocks. Borchardt may not have been far off with his analysis of the mechanism that was contained with the antechamber. After building the resonators and installing them inside the Grand Gallery, we would want to focus into the King's Chamber sound of a specific frequency, i.e. a pure tone or harmonic chord. We would be assured of doing so if we installed an acoustic filter between the Grand Gallery and the King's Chamber. By installing baffles inside the antechamber, sound waves traveling from the Grand Gallery through the passageway into the King's Chamber would be filtered as they passed through, allowing only a single frequency or harmonic of that frequency to enter the resonant King's Chamber. Sound wave lengths not coinciding with the dimensions between the baffles are filtered out, thereby ensuring that only no-interference sound waves enter the resonant King's Chamber, a condition that would reduce the output of the system. To explain the half-round grooves on one side of the chamber and the flat surface on the other, we could speculate that when the installation of these baffles took place they received a final tuning or tweaking. This may have been accomplished by using cams. By rotating these cams, the off-centered shaft would raise or lower the baffles until the throughput of sound was maximized. A slight movement may have been all that was necessary. Maximum throughput is accomplished when the ceiling of the first part of the passageway from the Grand Gallery, the ceiling of the passageway leading from the acoustic filter to the resonant King's Chamber, and the bottom surface of each baffle are in alignment. The shaft suspending the baffles would have then been locked into place in a pillar block located on the flat surface of the wainscoting on the opposite wall. Knowing that a vibrating system can eventually destroy itself, Dunn says that if there is no means to draw off or dampen the energy, there would have to be some way to control the level of energy at which the system operates. As the output of the resonant cavity would only draw off the energy up to a certain level, that being the maximum amount the granite complex could process, there would have to be some means of controlling the energy as it built up inside the Grand Gallery. Dunn says that normally there would be 3 ways to prevent a vibrating system from running out of control. 1. Shut off the source of the vibration. Can't do that. 2. Reverse the process that was used to couple the vibration of the pyramid with the earth. 3. Contrive a means to keep the vibration at a safe level. Says Dunn, with the source of the vibration being the earth, obviously numbers 2 and 3 are our best options. There are 2 ways to eliminate constant vibration. One is to dampen it, and the other is to counteract the vibration with an interference wave that cancels it out. Physically dampening the vibration would be impractical, considering the function of the machine. The dampening wouldn't always be necessary, unlike the dampening needs of a bridge, and indeed would have an adverse effect on the efficiency of the machine. Consequently, it would involve moving parts, like those in a piano. Faced with this consideration, I immediately started to look closer at the ascending passage. It is the only feature inside the Great Pyramid that contains devices that are directly accessible from the outside. I call the granite plugs inside this passage devices in the same context that I called the granite beams above the king's chamber devices, because it wasn't necessary to use granite to block this passage, and limestone would have been sufficient. It is obvious that their effectiveness at securing the inner chambers from robbers had the reverse effect. They drew attention to the existence of the ascending passage, and subsequently the entire internal arrangement of passages and chambers. The granite plugs had to have another reason for being there. Possibly they were built into the structure to allow or facilitate interference sound waves being introduced into the grand gallery, and prevent the build-up of vibration within from reaching destructive levels. It may be the reason that the builders selected granite instead of limestone to plug the ascending passage. Concludes Dunn. The three plugs and their spacing within the passage may have in fact provided feedback to signal when the energy was reaching a dangerous level. By directing in or out of phase sound waves up the ascending passage, they may have been able to control the energy level of the system. By directing a signal of the correct frequency, they may also have been able to prime the system in this manner also. In other words, the entire system would be forced to vibrate, and once in motion, it would draw energy from the earth with no further input. Sir William Flinders Petrie examined these blocks and described them in pyramids and temples of Giza. He remarked that the adjoining faces of the block were not flat, but had a wavy finish, plus or minus 0.3 inches. I was unable to confirm this when I was in Egypt, because the blocks, exposed by Al-Mamun's tunnel, had slipped since Petrie's day, and are now resting against each other. However, it does make for interesting speculation. Were the faces of the blocks cut specifically to modify sound waves? Could the ascending passage serve to direct an interference out-of-phase sound wave into the grand gallery, thereby controlling the level of energy in the system? There are mysteries still yet to be answered. But we are not finished yet. Those who would take over the earth and shape it to their will never, I notice, succeed. Lao Tzu, Tao Te Ching. The Great Crystal of Edgar Cayce. In a similar manner to Dunn's theories on the Great Pyramid is the psychic information from Edgar Cayce and the Association for Research and Enlightenment in Virginia Beach, Virginia. Known as the Sleeping Clairvoyant, Edgar Cayce was born on March 18, 1877, on a farm near Hopkinsville, Kentucky. Even as a child, he displayed powers of perception which seemed to extend beyond the normal range. In 1898, at the age of 21, he became a salesman for a wholesale stationery company, and developed a gradual paralysis of the throat muscles which threatened the loss of his voice. When doctors were unable to find a cause for the strange paralysis, he began to see a hypnotist. During a trance, the first of many for Cayce, he recommended medication and manipulative therapy, which successfully restored his voice and cured his throat trouble. He began doing readings for people, mostly of a medical nature, and on October 9, 1910, the New York Times carried 2 pages of headlines and pictures on the Cayce phenomenon. By the time Edgar Cayce died on January 3, 1945, in Virginia Beach, Virginia, he left well over 14,000 documented stenographic records of the telepathic clairvoyant statements he had given for more than 8,000 different people over a period of 43 years. These typewritten documents are referred to as readings. Important to our discussion in this book is that many of these readings concern Atlantis, persons' former lives in Atlantis, and the airships and motive power used in Atlantis. In reading 2437-1, January 23, 1941, Cayce told his subject, "In Atlantean land, during those periods of greater expansion as to ways, means, and manners of applying greater conveniences for the people of the land, things of transportation, the aeroplane as called today, but then as ships of the air, for they sailed not only in the air but in other elements also." A number of persons who came to Cayce for individual life readings were, according to Cayce's reading, once navigators or engineers on these aircraft. In Atlantean land, when there were the developments of those things as made from motivative forces, as carried the peoples into the various portions of the land and to other lands. Entity and navigator of note, then. In Atlantean land, when peoples understood the law of universal forces, entity, able to carry messages, through space to the other lands, guided crafts of that period. Casey called the motive power used in these vessels the night side of life. In Atlantean land, or Passadia, entity ruled in pomp and power, and in understanding of the mysteries of the application of that often termed the night side of life, or in applying the universal forces as understood in that period. In Atlantean period of those peoples that gained much in understanding of mechanical laws and application of night side of life for destruction. Casey speaks of the use of crystals or firestones for energy and related applications. He also speaks of the misuse of power and warnings of destruction to come. In Atlantean land, during the periods of Exodus, due to foretelling or foreordination of activities which were bringing about destructive forces, among those who were not only in Yucatan, but in the Pyrenees and Egyptian land, for the manners of transportation and communications through airships of that period were such as Ezekiel described at a much later date. In Atlantis, when there were activities that brought about the second upheaval in the land, entity was what would be in the present the electrical engineer, applied those forces or influences for airplanes, ships, and what you would today call radio for constructive or destructive purposes. In Atlantean land before the second destruction, when there was the dividing of islands, when the temptations were begun in activities of sons of Belial and the children of the law of one. Early among those that interpreted the messages received through the crystals and the fires that were to be the eternal fires of nature. New developments in air and water travel are no surprise to this entity, as these were beginning development at that period for escape. In Atlantean land, at time of development of electrical forces that dealt with transportation of craft from place to place, photographing at a distance, overcoming gravity itself, preparation of the crystal, the terrible, mighty crystal, much of this brought destruction. In city of Pios in Atlantis, among people who gained understanding of application of night side of life, or negative influences in the earth's spheres, of those who gave much understanding to the manner of sound, voice, and picture, and such to peoples of that period. In Passadia, the entity dwelt among those that had charge of the storage of the motivative forces from the great crystals that so condensed the lights, the forms of the activities, as to guide the ships in the sea and in the air, and in conveniences of the body as television and recording voice. The use of crystals as an important part of the technology is mentioned in a very long reading from December 29th, 1933. About the firestone, the entity's activities then made such applications as dealt both with the constructive as well as destructive forces in that period. It would be well that there be given something of a description of this, so that it may be understood better by the entity in the present. In the center of a building which would today be said to be lined with non-conductive stone, something akin to asbestos, with other non-conductors, such as are now being manufactured in England under a name which is well known to many of those who deal in such things. The building above the stone was oval, or a dome wherein there could be a portion for rolling back, so that the activity of the stars, the concentration of energies that emanate from bodies that are on fire themselves, along with elements that are found and not found in the earth's atmosphere. The concentration through the prisms, or glass, as would be called in the present, was in such manner that it acted upon the instruments which were connected with the various modes of travel through induction methods, which made much the same character of control as would in the present day be termed remote control through radio vibrations or directions, though the kind of force impelled from the stone acted upon the motivation forces in the crafts themselves. The building was constructed so that when the dome was rolled back there might be little or no hindrance in the direct application of power to various crafts that were to be impelled through space, whether within the radius of vision or whether directed under water or under other elements, or through other elements. The preparation of this stone was solely in the hands of the initiates at the time, and the entity was among those who directed the influences of radiation which arose, in the form of rays that were invisible to the eye but acted upon the stones themselves as set in the motivating forces, whether the aircraft were lifted by the gases of the period, or whether for guiding the more of pleasure vehicles that might pass along close to the earth, or crafts on the water or under the water. These, then, were impelled by the concentration of rays from the stone, which was centered in the middle of the power station, or powerhouse, as would be the term in the present. In the active forces of these, the entity brought destructive forces by setting up, in various portions of the land, the kind that was to act in producing powers for the various forms of the people's activities in the same cities, the towns, and the countries surrounding same. These, not intentionally, were tuned too high, and brought the second period of destructive forces to the people of the land, and broke up the land into those isles which later became the scene of further destructive forces in the land. Through the same form of fire, the bodies of individuals were regenerated by burning, through application of rays from the stone, the influences that brought destructive forces to an animal organism. Hence the body often rejuvenated itself, and it remained in that land until the eventual destruction, joining with the peoples who made for the breaking up of the land, or joining with Belial at the final destruction of the land. In this the entity lost. At first it was not the intention nor desire for destructive forces. Later it was for ascension of power itself. As for a description of the manner of construction of the stone, we find it was a large cylindrical glass, as would be termed today, cut with facets, in such manner that the capstone on top of it made for centralizing the power or force that concentrated between the end of the cylinder and the capstone itself. As indicated, the records as to ways of constructing same are in 3 places in the earth, as it stands today: in the sunken portion of Atlantis, or Poseidia, where a portion of the temples may yet be discovered under the slime of ages of sea-water, near what is known as Bimini, off the coast of Florida, and secondly in the temple records that were in Egypt, where the entity acted later in cooperation with others toward preserving the records that came from the land where these had been kept. Also, thirdly, in records that were carried to what is now Yucatan, in America, where these stones, which they know so little about, are now, during the last few months, being uncovered. A giant pyramid under water at Bimini? Bimini Island is a small member of the Bahamas, located about 50 miles east of Miami. Besides having sandy beaches, coral reefs, a variety of sunken ships, and some excellent fishing areas, Bimini is also the site for a series of very unusual underwater stone formations. This assemblage of huge blocks, many existing in straight patterns, are submerged under only 20 or 30 feet of water. There may also be a large pyramid in the vicinity of Bimini as well, under water. The Bimini Wall was first discovered in 1968 by Dr. J. Manson Valentine, Florida's maverick archaeologist. Valentine first saw the wall from the surface of the water when the sea was especially clear. He was with 3 other divers at the time, Jacques Maillot, Harold Climo, and Robert Angove. Said Valentine in an interview, "An extensive pavement of rectangular and polygonal flat stones of varying size and thickness, obviously shaped and accurately aligned to form a convincingly artifactual arrangement. These stones had evidently lain submerged over a long span of time, for the edges of the biggest ones had become rounded off, giving the blocks the domed appearance of giant loaves of bread or pillows. Some were absolutely rectangular, sometimes approaching perfect squares. One remembers that absolutely straight lines are never present in natural formations. The larger pieces, at least 10 to 15 feet in length, often ran the width of parallel-sided avenues, while the small ones formed mosaic-like pavements covering broader sections. The avenues of apparently fitted stones are straight-sided and parallel. The long one is a clear-cut double series interrupted by 2 expanses, containing very large flat stones propped up at the corners by vertical members, like the ancient dolmens of Europe, and the southeast end of this great roadway terminates in a beautifully curved corner. The 3 short causeways of accurately aligned large stones are of uniform width and end in cornerstones. Dr. David Zink of the U.S. Air Force Academy in Colorado began doing research around Bimini that continues to this day. His book, The Stones of Atlantis, chronicles his many adventures, with many good photographs in the waters around Bimini. Dr. Zink firmly believes that the Bimini Road is a man-made structure, but he has debunked a few of the other structures in the area, including a rectangular structure off Andros Island that was once believed to have been a temple site, but is now believed to be a sponge pen built in the 1930s. In 1974, he even photographed an unusual stone column standing upright that was believed to be the point of an obelisk that stood 40 to 50 feet tall, though most of it was buried in the ocean floor mud. Many believers in Atlantis have been very excited by these finds just opposite Miami, as Edgar Cayce had predicted that the first portion of the lost continent to be discovered would be located in this general area. Cayce, who died in 1945, had predicted that the first portion of Atlantis to rise would be found in 1968 or 1969. Aerial reconnaissance of this region in 1968 and subsequent dives did indeed reveal these stone structures breaking the surface of the ocean floor. Another possibility is that these massive blocks are more likely the product of an early indigenous Indian civilization. Such a development could have served as the mother culture of the Olmecs and Maya in nearby Mesoamerica, as well as influenced the high centers of South America. At present, however, the weight of evidence is that these rocks may just be unique natural formations. Geologists and archaeologists have not found enough evidence to convince them to change their point of view. They contend that the area is simply composed of a rather unusual type of fractured beach rock. Countless books have been written on the Bermuda Triangle, sometimes called the Devil's Triangle, of which Bimini is a part. Most books claim that some sort of vortex or time warp is responsible for missing ships, vanished airplanes, instruments that go haywire, and weird magnetic and atmospheric phenomena. There is good evidence that an energy vortex, or gravitational anomaly as they are sometimes called, is operating in the heavily trafficked waters off of Florida. In this area between Miami, Bermuda, and Puerto Rico, literally hundreds of ships and planes have vanished. In a few odd cases, ships have been found derelict without crews. Very little wreckage has been found. In 1990, it was announced that the 5 Navy torpedo bombers that had vanished in the Bermuda Triangle on December 5, 1945, had been discovered off the waters of Fort Lauderdale. Later it was announced that these were not the missing planes, but a different set of crashed airplanes, with 2 of the craft having the same identification number. According to Charles Berlitz, the grandson of the founder of the Berlitz Language Schools and the author of the worldwide bestseller The Bermuda Triangle, plus other books on Atlantis and mysteries of the world, there are quite a few strange instances that have been recorded concerning the bizarre and life-threatening effects that occur in the Bermuda Triangle. According to Berlitz, an oceanic investigative party on the yacht New Freedom in July 1975 passed through an intense but rainless electromagnetic storm. During one tremendous burst of energy, Dr. Jim Thorpe photographed the exploding sky. The photograph, when developed, showed the burst in the sky, but it showed, too, a square-rigged ship on the sea about 100 feet away from the New Freedom, although a moment before the sea had been empty. John Sander, a steward on the Queen Elizabeth I, saw a small plane silently flying alongside his ship at deck level. He alerted another steward and the officer of the watch while the plane silently splashed into the ocean only 75 yards from the ship. The QE-1 turned around and sent a boat over, but no indication of anything was found. Another phantom plane silently crashed into the ocean at Daytona Beach on February 17, 1935, in front of hundreds of witnesses, but an immediate search revealed nothing at all in the shallow water by the beach. A Cessna 172, piloted by Helen Cascio, took off for Turk's Island, Bahamas, with a single passenger. About the time she should have arrived, a Cessna 172 was seen by the tower circling the island, but not landing. Voices from the plane could be heard by the tower, but landing instructions from the tower evidently could not be heard by the pilot. A woman's voice was heard saying, "I must have made a wrong turn. That should be Turks, but there's nothing down there. No airport, no houses." In the meantime, the tower attempted to give landing to the unresponsive Cessna. Finally, the woman's voice said, "Is there no way out of this?" And the Cessna, watched by hundreds of people, flew away from Turks into a cloud bank from which it apparently never exited, since the plane, the pilot, and the passenger were never found. As Berlitz points out, the plane had been visible to the people on Turks, but when the pilot looked down, apparently she saw only an undeveloped island. Had she been seeing the island at a point in time before the airport and the houses were built? Where did this plane finally land? Did it land on the beach of some past or future world? Various theories have been put forth to explain the Bermuda Triangle mystery. Sudden giant waves or eruptions of underwater volcanoes, whirlpools, and holes in the ocean have all been used as possible causes. Most researchers are willing to admit, though, that some sort of electromagnetic disturbance that causes instruments to malfunction is operating in the area. There are local stories of strange, dense, compact fogs on the surface of the water or in the sky. According to local belief, ships or aircraft that enter these odd clouds do not emerge. Berlitz gives us the theory of Tom Gary, author of Adventures of an Amateur Psychic, claims that the Bermuda Triangle's destructive force comes from energy emanating from beneath the sea. "There is speculation that a power structure is still underwater in the Bermuda area," wrote Gary. According to him, the structure sits atop a large core that extends down through the crust of the earth. When conditions are right, the power structure works intermittently, causing ship and plane captains to lose control of their craft. According to Gary, streaming ions form an electric current that produces a magnetic field, and this causes instrument failure in craft in the vicinity. Magnetic compasses, fuel gauges, altitude indicators, and all electrically operated instruments are affected. Pilots who have survived such activity have reported battery drainage as well. An incredible story is told by Ray Brown of Mesa, Arizona, that concerns an ancient pyramid off the Berry Islands in the Bahamas. In 1970, Brown claims to have been in a big storm while on the Berry Islands, having been looking for sunken galleons. In the morning after the storm, he says, their compasses were spinning and their magnometers were not giving any readings. "We took off northeast from the island. It was murky, but suddenly we could see outlines of buildings under the water. It seemed to be a large exposed area of an underwater city. We were 5 divers, and we all jumped in and dove down, looking for anything we could find," said Brown in an interview with Charles Berlitz. "As we swam on, the water became clearer. I was close to the bottom at 135 feet and was trying to keep up with the diver ahead of me. I turned to look toward the sun through the murky water and saw a pyramid shape shining like a mirror. About 35 to 40 feet from the top was an opening. I was reluctant to go inside, but I swam in anyway. The opening was like a shaft debouching into an inner room. I saw something shining. It was a crystal held by 2 metallic hands. I had on my gloves, and I tried to loosen it. It became loose. As soon as I grabbed it, I felt this was the time to get out and not come back." I'm not the only person who has seen these ruins. Others have seen them from the air and say they're 5 miles wide and more than that in length. Berlitz reports that 3 of the other divers have since died in accidents in the Bermuda Triangle, and that Brown occasionally shows the crystal that he allegedly took from the sunken pyramid to lecture audiences. Berlitz has seen the crystal himself, though it is not necessarily from a pyramid in the Caribbean. Brown will not reveal the exact site of the city, but he believes that the pyramid and other buildings extend far below the ocean floor. He was only lucky that the storm the day before had cleared the ruins of sand and silt. While this story seems almost too fantastic to be true, there is the distinct possibility that it is somehow based on fact. The fact that there may be a giant pyramid somewhere near Florida that is causing powerful electromagnetic effect. This giant pyramid might be another of the giant generating stations that once existed around the world, similar to Christopher Dunn's theories on the Great Pyramid. 8. The cyclical nature of history. The world is a dangerous place to live, not because of the people who are evil, but because of the people who don't do anything about it. Albert Einstein. Life is either a daring adventure or it is nothing. Helen Keller. The cyclical nature of history. History is cyclical in nature, the evidence shows us. What is today was before. What was yesterday will be tomorrow. We need to learn from our mistakes, so that instead of traveling endlessly in a repetitious cycle, we move in an upward spiral toward perfection and utopia. We are today as the gods of yesterday. We fly through the air, we communicate with magic mirrors and talking boxes. We have tremendous war machines, and move things in a way that seems like magic. The cyclical nature of history brings us around to ages of great technology, as well as to dark ages of ignorance and scientific repression. To get humankind through the Dark Ages, secret societies and secret libraries have been created to protect important knowledge, such as the fact that the world is a sphere, that electricity can be used for lighting, etc. Things that are part of everyday life today were yesterday's secrets. How many people have been tortured and killed in the effort to prevent technological and scientific advancement? The list would be a long one. The Book of Enoch. The Bible is important, not only in a religious context, but as a historical document. The Bible gives us tales, in many cases derived from ancient Sumeria and Egypt, that would otherwise be lost to us because of the destruction of knowledge throughout history. 14 ancient texts considered for inclusion in the Bible were ultimately left out of most versions. These books are collectively called the Apocrypha. The apocryphal Book of Enoch the Prophet was first discovered in Abyssinia in the year 1773 by a Scottish explorer named James Bruce. Bruce, a sort of 18th-century Indiana Jones, may have seen the Ark of the Covenant at Aksum, or its copy, as we surmise, and was able to obtain the ancient Coptic Christian text, approximately 2,000 years old. In 1821 the Book of Enoch was translated by Richard Lawrence and published in a number of successive editions, culminating in the 1883 edition. Says the Book of Enoch in chapter 13, "Moreover, Azazel taught men to make swords, knives, shields, breastplates, the fabrications of mirrors, and the workmanship of bracelets and ornaments, the use of paint, the beautifying of the eyebrow, the use of stones of every valuable and select kind, and of all sorts of dyes, so that the world became altered." Here we have yet another example of technology being handed over to mankind in ancient times by a helping god or Superman, reminiscent of the stories of Osiris, Quetzalcoatl, and Tubal-Cain. This was world-altering technology, and it is interesting to note that the first items mentioned have to do with waging war. Who was Azazel, and where did he get the knowledge that he imparted? The Cave of the Ancients. The curious and rather prolific British author T. Lobsang Rampa wrote a popular book on the theme of the cyclical nature of history in 1963, called The Cave of the Ancients. In the book, reportedly non-fiction, the young Rampa, a boy monk in Tibet, is taken to a remote spot by his teacher-guru to see the amazing Cave of the Ancients, a repository of ancient machines and devices. As they entered the remote hidden cave, says Rampa, the four of us stood silent and frightened, gazing at the fantastic sight before us, a sight which would have made any one of us alone think that he had taken leave of his senses. The cave was more like an immense hall. It stretched away in the distance as if the mountain itself was hollow. The light was everywhere, beating down upon us from a number of globes, which appeared to be suspended from the darkness of the roof. Strange machines crammed the place, machines such as we could not have imagined. Even from the high roof hung suspended apparatus and mechanisms. Some, I saw with great amazement, were covered by what appeared to be the clearest of glass. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, a misty glow formed in the darkness before us. At first it was just a suspicion of blue-pink light, almost as if a ghost were materializing before our gaze. The mist lights spread, becoming brighter so that we could see the outlines of incredible machines filling this large hall, all except the center of the floor upon which we sat. The light drew in upon itself, swirling, fading, and becoming brighter, and then it formed and remained in spherical shape. I had the strange and unexplainable impression of age-old machinery creaking slowly into motion after eons of time. The Lama Mingyar Dondup tells young Rampa, "Thousands and thousands of years ago there was a high civilization upon this world. Men could fly through the air in machines which defied gravity. Men were able to make machines which would impress thoughts upon the minds of others, thoughts that would appear as pictures. They had nuclear fission, and at last they detonated a bomb which all but wrecked the world, causing continents to sink below the oceans and others to rise. The world was decimated, and so, throughout the religions of this earth, we now have the story of the flood." The Lama continues, "There is a similar chamber at a certain place in the country of Egypt. There is another chamber with identical machines located in a place called South America. I have seen them. I know where they are. These secret chambers were concealed by the peoples of old, so that their artifacts would be found by a later generation when the time was ready." The group moves through the galleries inside the mountain. We moved to the panel which the Lama Mingyar Dondup had told me about previously, and at our approach it opened with a grating creak, so loud in the silence of the place that I think we all jumped up with alarm. Inside was the darkness, profound, almost as if we had clouds of blackness swirling about us. Our feet were guided by shallow channels in the floor. We shuffled along, and when the channels ended we sat down. As we did so there came a series of clicks, like metal scraping against metal, and almost imperceptibly light stole across the darkness and pushed it aside. We looked about us and saw more machines, strange machines. There were statues here and pictures carved in metal. Before we had time to more than glance, the light drew in upon itself and formed a glowing globe in the center of the hall. Colors flickered aimlessly, and bands of light without apparent meaning swirled round the globe. Pictures formed, at first blurred and indistinct, then growing vivid and real, and with three-dimensional effect. We watched intently. This was the world of long, long ago, when the world was very young. Mountains stood where now there are seas, and the pleasant seaside resorts are now mountain tops. The weather was warmer, and strange creatures roamed afield. This was a world of scientific progress. Strange machines rolled along, flew inches from the surface of the earth, or flew miles up in the air. Great temples reared their pinnacles skywards, as if in challenge to the clouds. Animals and man talked telepathically together. But all was not bliss. Politicians fought against politicians. The world was a divided camp in which each side coveted the lands of the other. Suspicion and fear were the clouds under which the ordinary man lived. Priests of both sides proclaimed that they alone were the favored of the gods. In the pictures before us we saw ranting priests, as now, purveying their own brand of salvation, at a price. Priests of each sect taught that it was a holy duty to kill the enemy. Almost in the same breath, they preached that mankind throughout the world were brothers. The illogicality of brother killing brother did not occur to them. We saw great wars fought, with most of the casualties being civilians. The armed forces behind their armor were mostly safe. The aged, the women and children, those who did not fight, were the ones to suffer. We saw glimpses of scientists working in laboratories, working to produce even deadlier weapons, working to produce bigger and better bugs to drop on the enemy. One sequence of pictures showed a group of thoughtful men planning what they termed a time capsule, what we called the Cave of the Ancients, wherein they could store for later generations working models of their machines, and a complete pictorial record of their culture and lack of it. Immense machines excavated the living rock. Hordes of men installed the models and the machines. We saw the cold light spheres hoisted in place, inert radioactive substances giving off light for millions of years. Inert in that it could not harm humans, active in that the light would continue almost until the end of time itself. A hollow mountain as an atomic refuge. Fantastic as Lobsang Rampa's tale may seem, it is billed as non-fiction, and there are other sources which support the idea of secret repositories of knowledge, also the existence of caves full of high-tech equipment. Today we do not make giant pyramids like the Great Pyramid of Egypt. Instead, we make giant underground military bases, such as Area 51 in Nevada. We even hollow out entire mountains. The NORAD Defense Command at Cheyenne Mountain in Colorado Springs is a hollow mountain with an entire city inside it. The normal citizen walking inside Cheyenne Mountain would be absolutely astonished at the level of technology within the facility. These high-tech bases are housed underground to protect them in the event of catastrophe, including nuclear war. Sounds similar to the Cave of the Ancients? Other hollow mountains were said to have existed in ancient times as well. Mount Shasta in northern California is one such mountain. Mount Shasta is sometimes said to have a Lemurian city inside of it. Strange lights are said to be seen from time to time on the mountain, and UFOs are reported to appear there. The great Chinese philosopher Lao Tzu often talked of the ancient ones in his writings, much as Confucius did. They were wise and knowledgeable, human beings that were as gods, powerful, good, loving, and all-knowing. These ancients apparently lived in a secret remote area of China or Tibet, guarding the wisdom of the ages. Born around 604 BC, Lao Tzu wrote the book which is still perhaps the most famous Chinese classic of all time, the Tao Te Ching. When he finally left China, at the close of his very long life, he journeyed to the west, to the legendary land of Mu, to seek the headquarters of the Ancient Ones, the Great White Brotherhood. It was as he was leaving, at one of the border posts of western China, that a guard persuaded him to write down the Tao Te Ching, so that Lao Tzu's wisdom would not be lost. The ancient masters were subtle, mysterious, profound, responsive. The depth of their knowledge is unfathomable. Because it is unfathomable, all we can do is to describe their appearance. Watchful, like men crossing a winter stream. Alert, like men aware of danger. Courteous, like visiting guests. Yielding, like ice about to melt. Simple, like uncarved blocks of wood. Lao Tzu, Tao Te Ching, Chapter 15. No one ever heard of Lao Tzu again, and it is presumed that he made it to the land of Mu. Mu is another name for the popular Chinese goddess Kuan Yin, the merciful guardian and queen mother of the West. Her land, traditionally located in the Kunlun Mountains, was known as the Abode of the Immortals and the Western Paradise. In Myths and Legends of China, a collection published in 1922, Mu is connected to a lost continent. Mu was formed of the pure quintessence of the western air in the legendary continent of Shenzhou. As Mukong, formed of the eastern air, is the active principle of the male air and sovereign of the eastern air, so Mu, born of the western air, is the passive or female principle, yin, and sovereign of the western air. These two principles cooperating engender heaven and earth and all the beings of the universe, and thus become the two principles of life and of the subsistence of all that exists. She is the head of the troop of genii dwelling on the Kunlun Mountains. the Taoist equivalent of the Buddhist Sumeru, and from time to time holds intercourse with favored imperial votaries. Shiwangmu's palace is situated in the high mountains of the snowy Kunlun. It is 100 li, about 333 miles, in circuit. A rampart of massive gold surrounds its battlements of precious stones. Its right wing rises on the edge of the Kingfisher's River. It is the usual abode of the immortals, who are divided into 7 special categories according to the color of their garments: red, blue, black, violet, yellow, green, and nature color. There is a marvelous fountain built of precious stones, where the periodical banquet of the immortals is held. This feast is called Pan Tao Hui, the Feast of the Peaches. It takes place on the borders of Yao Chi, Lake of Gems, and is attended by both male and female immortals. Over the years of Chinese history, many expeditions were sent out to the Kunlun Mountains, the Mount Olympus of ancient China, in an attempt to contact the Ancient Ones. In the Jin dynasty, 265 to 420 A.D., the Emperor Wu Ti ordered the scholar Shu to re-edit the bamboo books found in the tomb of an ancient king named Ling Wang, the son of Hui Chengwang, ruler of Wei State, circa 245 B.C. The books recorded the travels of the Zhou dynasty Emperor Mu, 1001 to 946 B.C., who journeyed to the Kunlun Mountains to pay a visit the royal mother of the West. The emperor met with Shiwangmu on the auspicious day Chatsu. The ancient Chinese counted days and years in a special cyclical fashion, similar to the ancient Mayans of Central America. There are 10 characters known as the 10 stems of heaven, and another 12 characters known as the 12 branches of earth. The combination of these 2 sets of characters give names to the 60 years of the Chinese cycle. They named and counted days in the same way. Emperor Mu had an audience with Shiwangmu on the bank of Jasper Lake in the Kunlun range. She blessed him and sang for him, and the emperor promised to return in 3 years, after bringing peace and prosperity to his millions of subjects. He then had rocks engraved as a record of his visit, and departed eastward across the desert back to his kingdom. Not all were so lucky as to meet the goddess, however. While traveling just north of the Kunlun Mountains in Xinjiang, the famous Russian artist, explorer, and mystic Nikola Tesla first heard of the Valley of the Immortals, located just over the mountains. Behind that mountain live holy men, who are saving humanity through wisdom. Many tried to see them but failed. Somehow as soon as they go over the ridge they lose their way, he was told. A native guide told him of huge vaults inside the mountains, where treasures had been stored from the beginning of history. He also indicated that tall white people had been disappearing into those rock galleries. Nikolaus Röhrig was at one time in the possession of a fragment of a magical stone from another world, called in Sanskrit the Chintamani stone. Alleged to come from the star system of Sirius, ancient Asian chronicles claim that a divine messenger from the heavens gave a fragment of the stone to Emperor Taslavu of Atlantis. According to legend, the stone was later sent to King Solomon in Jerusalem, whom, you will remember, was said to have traveled all over Asia and Africa in a Vimana airship. He split the stone and made a ring out of one piece. The stone is believed by some people to be moldavite, a magnetic stone sold in crystal shops, said to have fallen to Earth in a meteor shower 14.8 million years ago. Moldavite is said to be a spiritual accelerator, and has achieved a certain popularity in recent years. It is entirely possible that the Chintamani stone is a special piece of moldavite. It is worth noting here, too, that the sacred black stone kept in the Kaaba of Mecca, to which all Muslims pray, is also a piece of meteorite. Nikolaus Röhrig himself saw what was possibly a Vimana from the land of Shiwangmu in the Kunlun. In his travel diary of August 5, 1926, while in the Kukunor district, he noted that their caravan saw something big and shiny reflecting the sun, like a huge oval moving at great speed. Crossing our camp, this thing changed in this direction from south to southwest, and we saw how it disappeared in the intense blue sky. We even had time to take our field glasses, and saw quite distinctly an oval form with a shiny surface, one side of which was brilliant from the sun. The strong similarity between the legends of Shambhala and the secret land of Shiwangmu is easily noticed. Shambhala, reputedly located in Tibet, is famous as a repository of ancient wisdom, sheltered from the ages in a secluded valley. An ancient library was also said to be kept underground in Tibet. In some traditions, the library is said to be near Lhasa, possibly connected to the underground tunnels beneath the Potala, the Dalai Lama's fabulous skyscraper. The stories of hidden archives and centers of learning are too universal and widespread to be easily dismissed. Incredible as it may seem, there may be a repository of ancient Chinese knowledge in the Kunlun range of northwestern Tibet. Perhaps a hollow mountain filled with relics of ancient technology? Technology is war-driven. It is my belief that advanced technology was developed over 12,000 years ago. This technology was used in some civilizations around the world, though not all. Just as Stone Age tribes still live in the highlands of New Guinea and other places today, many people were still primitive in those days as well. We call these ancient high-tech civilizations Atlantis, Rama, Osiris, and other names. Atlantis, I believe, is beneath the mid-Atlantic in the vicinity of the Azores and the Bahamas. Although it was a small continent, its influence reached across the waters to the Americas and to what are now Britain, Ireland, and the Mediterranean area. This Atlantic island civilization was contemporary with other civilizations, such as the Osirian civilization of the Mediterranean, Egypt, and North Africa, and the Rama Empire of India. In the Far East, perhaps in Indonesia and Southeast Asia, was another advanced civilization strongly connected to ancient India and the Rama Empire. Around 10,000 BC, geological upheavals, perhaps both natural and man-made, sank Atlantis and affected the whole world, especially Europe and the Americas. The Mediterranean was apparently flooded at this time, creating the various islands and unique megalithic cultures around this inland sea. Much of the ancient technology was lost to humankind. 1,000 years after the destruction of Atlantis and upheavals in other empires, the Hittites and Egyptians began to explore the newly created Mediterranean Sea area and the Atlantic. In the Americas, early groups, such as the Tiahuanaco culture and the Mayans, began to recreate their civilizations. Seafarers of the legendary Atlantean League began to cross the Atlantic again by about 6,000 BC. These same Mediterraneans colonized areas of northern Europe, including the British Isles as far north as the Shetlands, Setlands. North Sea earthquakes finished off the coastal civilization that inhabited much of the Netherlands, Denmark, and Sweden. This civilization was much later than Atlantis, probably reaching its height about 1500 BC. At about this time, or shortly thereafter, the Sea Peoples with their horned helmets came from Denmark, England, Holland, Germany, and France to the Mediterranean to invade Greece, Egypt, and the Hittite Empire. Like today, powerful nations fought wars that spanned entire continents. Secret societies like the Knights Templar turned ancient Phoenician ports into their own strongholds. There is an old saying, "What goes around comes around." Mankind's love for warfare has both fueled his technology and created much destruction and woe. Great teachers incarnate from time to time to try to teach man to love his neighbor and to live in a peaceful, helpful manner with others. Yet our history is one of non-stop warfare and invasion. Technology is in many ways driven by warfare. Man slaughters man, and the gods look down in pain and sorrow at what we have created for ourselves. Plato and the Egyptian priests have given us the story of one ancient civilization that waged war on the rest of the world with disastrous results. Today's looming wars have their roots in history. the creation of the Christian Church, the creation of the Islamic Empire, the creation of the Jewish refugee state of Israel, the conflict of ancient foes over energy sources and land control. The current war being fought by the Russians in Chechnya is also one of religious conflict combined with the desire to control oil wealth from the Caspian Sea. Now that technology has again reached a point of no return, perhaps we are ready to jump to the next level, a level beyond the technology of today, the technology of the gods tomorrow. A technology that allows man to finally learn to live in harmony with nature and his fellow man.